Millionaire CEO said, "Don't cry, sweetheart," to a stranger's child, until he saw her mother. No parent, no guardian, no one watching, just a child against the night. Inside a sleek black car idling at the curb, a man noticed her. Most people would have looked away. Most people would have told themselves someone else would handle it. Most people would have kept moving. He didn't. The car door opened. Rain rushed in. Leather shoes touched the slick ground. Umbrella in hand, he crossed the street with measured steps, each one deliberate, not rushed, not hesitant, simply certain. He stopped in front of her, then slowly lowered himself so his eyes met hers. His voice, when it came, was calm, steady, human. "Hey, why are you crying, sweetheart?" She lifted her face. Her eyes were glassy, her cheeks streaked with tears, her voice barely above a whisper. For a moment the city seemed to hold its breath. Rain slid down the curve of his umbrella in thin, steady streams. He didn't hover over her. He didn't loom. Instead, he bent at the knees and lowered himself until they were level. A powerful man choosing to make himself smaller so a frightened child wouldn't feel it. Water darkened his coat. It didn't matter. His face softened in a way few people ever saw. He searched her expression, not with suspicion, but with patience, the kind that comes from someone used to carrying heavy things quietly. "It's okay," he said, not rushing the words. "You're safe right now." She sniffled, knuckles pressed against her cheeks, breath hitching between sobs. You won't leave?" A pause, brief, sincere, final. "I won't." He shifted closer, angling the umbrella so the rain struck his shoulder instead of hers. The storm still raged around them, but inside that small circle of dry air, something steadied. Cars blurred past in the distance. Wind rattled leaves overhead. Somewhere, a siren faded. He didn't pepper her with questions. He didn't pretend to have all the answers. He simply sat with her, presence over panic, calm over chaos. Her breathing slowed, her grip loosened. For the first time since she'd been alone, the tears softened into quiet, trembling sniffles instead of raw fear. And in that simple, rain-soaked moment, something inside him shifted. A locked door creaking open after years of silence. A low, measured voice slid in as narration, clean and deliberate. That night, this billionaire thought he was just helping a lost child. He had no idea. That child would change his life forever. The city kept moving. Their story had just begun. Thunder cracked somewhere above the skyline, a sharp split that rippled through the air. For a heartbeat, the scene froze like a single, powerful frame. A soaked little girl on a lonely bench, a composed stranger crouched beside her, and a city too busy to notice either of them. Most people saw only traffic, deadlines, and their own concerns. He saw a child who needed someone to stay. The camera of your mind lingers here, not for spectacle, but for truth. Because this isn't just a dramatic moment in a story, it's something uncomfortably familiar. Everyone has stood alone at least once, not always in the rain, not always on a park bench, sometimes in a crowded room, sometimes in a marriage that feels empty, sometimes in a job that drains the life out of you. But alone is alone. Now flip that feeling. What if the person lost in the night wasn't you, but your daughter, your niece, a child you love more than your own breath? That single shift raises the stakes instantly. A child doesn't understand why the world moves without her. She only knows that the one person she trusts is gone, and the darkness feels much bigger than it should. That is the tension sitting at the center of this moment. Innocence versus indifference, vulnerability versus speed, fear versus stillness. And this man, powerful, insulated, accustomed to distance, chooses stillness. He stops. He kneels. He listens. The storm keeps pounding. The city keeps rushing. Yet in that small circle beneath the umbrella, something rare appears. Simple human care. A quiet narration slips in again, steady and deliberate. That night, this billionaire thought he was just helping a lost child. He had no idea. That child would change his life forever. The rain keeps falling, but the story is no longer just about weather. It's about what that weather reveals. Look past the child for a moment, past the bench, past the street lamp, past the busy road. What sits underneath this scene is something far deeper than a lost girl in a park. It's about people drifting through life without being seen. It's about success that looks impressive from the outside but feels hollow at night. It's about parents who love fiercely yet live one moment away from panic. It's about how quickly safety can disappear and how rarely strangers slow down. That's the problem beneath the surface. A city full of lights yet so much isolation. Millions of voices yet so many unheard. Constant movement yet very little connection. The little girl isn't just frightened because she can't find her mother. She is terrified because the world suddenly feels indifferent. Too big, too fast, too uncaring. And the man beside her knows that feeling all too well. He has sat in boardrooms packed with powerful people and still felt alone. He has walked through marble lobbies filled with employees and still felt invisible. He has built systems that serve entire cities, while quietly starving for something real. Different worlds, same emptiness. Right now, the rain is the noise of that emptiness, loud, cold, relentless. The umbrella is the choice to interrupt it. Every second he stays with her pushes against that problem. Every second he doesn't walk away is a quiet rebellion against a culture that says, keep moving, don't get involved, don't care too much. He stays anyway. Because in this single soaked moment, something matters more than schedules, status, or control. A child needs him, and for once he chooses to answer. The rain thins just a little, not enough to end the storm, only enough to let the moment breathe. The little girl's shoulders drop, her breathing steadies. The terror in her eyes softens into something quieter, fragile trust. She studies the man beside her the way children do when they sense sincerity, not with logic, but with instinct. He doesn't promise what he can't control. He doesn't play hero. He simply remains. And that choice changes the shape of the night, because this isn't only a story about a lost child and a wealthy stranger. It's about how lives intersect when no one is looking, how one decision, made in silence, can redirect everything that follows. But here is the question that hangs in the air. What happens when the mother finally appears? Will she see a rescuer or a threat? Will she recognize kindness or react out of fear? Will this be a brief, forgotten encounter, or the beginning of something neither of them expected? When she comes running through the rain, breathless and desperate, the story tilts. Everything shifts. Not in an obvious way, not with thunder or dramatic music, but in something quieter, more powerful. The collision of two separate worlds that were never meant to meet. A composed billionaire who avoids emotional attachment. A grieving single mother who has learned to stand alone. Two people carrying different burdens, unknowingly stepping onto the same path. A steady voice returns one last time, low and deliberate. That night, this billionaire thought he was just helping a lost child. He had no idea. That child would change his life forever if stories like this pull you in. Tap like and subscribe. You're in the right place. Because this moment in the rain is only the beginning. New York wore its power like a second skin. From the street, it was noise and motion. Horns, footsteps, lights, urgency. From above, it became something colder, sharper, almost surgical in its precision. High atop a glass tower that cut cleanly into the night sky, Enrico Hansen's office hovered over it all. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around the room, turning the city into a vast, glowing map beneath him. Traffic pulsed in slow, rhythmic veins. Bridges stretched like bright spines across dark water. Distant helicopters traced silent arcs through the clouds. Inside, everything was spare, no excess, no sentiment, no clutter that didn't serve a purpose. A long polished desk sat at the center. Behind it, a leather chair that had carried the weight of billion-dollar decisions. Along one wall, abstract art in muted tones. Along another, a shelf of awards he rarely looked at. This was not a room meant for comfort. It was a command post. When Enrico moved, people noticed, not because he demanded it, but because his presence altered the air. Colleagues spoke carefully around him. Competitors respected him. Some feared him. In boardrooms, he was known for three things: clarity, speed, and finality. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't perform. He asked precise questions, waited for precise answers, and made decisions that reshaped companies, contracts, and sometimes entire industries. If Enrico Hansen spoke, markets listened. If he went silent, people grew nervous. Yet tonight, like many nights, the room felt too big for just one man. A soft chime echoed through the office. The private elevator opened behind him, silent, seamless, untouched by the crowd 30 floors below. Only a handful of people ever rode it. Fewer still were invited. He didn't step inside. Instead, he turned back to the window, hands resting lightly on the glass, watching the city move without him. Lights flickered in distant apartments. A plane slid low across the horizon. Somewhere lives were colliding, breaking, and beginning, none of them aware of the man standing alone above it all. Power surrounded him. Stillness wrapped him. And beneath both, something else lingered, a quiet, stubborn emptiness he refused to name. When Enrico Hansen entered a boardroom, conversation didn't slowly fade. It ended. Not out of fear exactly, out of certainty. People adjusted their posture before he even sat down. Executives straightened their ties. Lawyers shuffled papers they already knew by heart. Consultants softened their confidence into something more careful. He carried authority the way some people carried charisma, naturally, without trying. At the head of a polished table that could seat 30, he looked almost still, but the room orbited him anyway. His reputation traveled ahead of him, brilliant in strategy, ruthless in negotiation, impeccable in detail. If a number didn't make sense, he found the flaw in seconds. If a proposal wasted time, he shut it down with 2 calm sentences. If a risk was worth taking, he committed without hesitation. Colleagues said he could sense weakness in a plan the way a storm senses pressure, instantly. Competitors respected him because he didn't play games. He didn't bluff. He didn't posture. He moved like someone who already knew the ending. Yet what unsettled people most wasn't his intellect, it was his distance. No small talk, no lingering smiles, no personal stories slipped in to soften the edge. In a world built on relationships, Enrico Hansen kept everyone at arm's length. Precise, professional, untouchable. Tonight, the boardroom was empty. The long table gleamed under soft overhead lights, untouched by chatter, debate, or power plays. Leather chairs sat neatly pushed in, as if waiting for a meeting that would never come. Only the faint hum of the building's systems filled the silence. Outside the glass walls, the city kept moving, indifferent, relentless, alive. Inside, everything felt suspended. Enrico stood at the head of the table, hands resting lightly on its surface. For a man who controlled so much, he looked unusually small against the scale of the room. Not weak, just alone, the kind of alone that success rarely acknowledges but often creates. A single notification chimed softly from his desk in the distance. Another email, another decision, another expectation. He didn't move toward it. He stayed where he was, staring at a room that obeyed him in every way except the one that mattered. The soft click of heels broke the quiet. Naomi moved through the office with practiced ease, efficient, observant, and always one step ahead of the needs of the man she worked for. She placed a thin folder on his desk without making a sound, aligned precisely with the edge. 2 inches from the corner, exactly where he preferred it. Rain traced faint lines down the glass behind him, blurring the city into wavering light. She watched him for a moment longer than protocol allowed. He was still standing by the windows, hands resting lightly on the glass, as if the skyline could answer questions he never asked aloud. "Sir," she said gently, her voice professional but not cold. "You need to go home. No urgency, no scolding, just quiet concern wrapped in respect." He didn't turn right away. Traffic flowed far below. A helicopter slid past the tower's edge. Somewhere, music drifted faintly from a distant apartment, too soft to make out, but present enough to remind him that life continued without him. Naomi shifted her weight, choosing her words carefully, the way she always did. "You've been here since before sunrise. Your meetings are finished. There's nothing that can't wait until morning." A pause stretched between them, not awkward, but heavy with unspoken understanding. Finally, Enrico moved. He straightened slowly, his reflection faint in the glass, a powerful man layered over a restless city. His voice, when it came, was low and steady. "I am home." Naomi exhaled quietly through her nose, not in frustration, but in something closer to worry. She knew better than to argue. She also knew better than to believe him. Still, she offered a small nod, gathering her tablet and turning toward the elevator. At the threshold, she hesitated, glancing back once more. The office swallowed him again, vast, polished, untouchable. She left without another word. The elevator doors closed in a silent seam of steel. The room returned to stillness. Enrico remained at the window, alone with the city he controlled in daylight and could not escape at night. The city pressed itself against the windows, bright and relentless, as if demanding his attention. Enrico did not give it. Instead, his gaze drifted inward, not dramatically, not theatrically, but with the quiet stillness of a man used to carrying things alone. His reflection looked back at him. Perfectly tailored suit, composed expression, shoulders straight, the image of control people paid millions to emulate. Yet beneath that surface sat something no boardroom could measure. Years earlier, he had loved without hesitation. He had trusted fully, spoken openly. Let someone see past the polished exterior and into the spaces he rarely revealed. That openness had cost him. Not through betrayal, not through spectacle, simply through loss, the kind that arrives quietly, stays permanently, and reshapes a person in ways they never fully explain. After that, Enrico rebuilt himself with precision. He learned to keep feelings contained, conversations clipped, and relationships measured. He replaced vulnerability with discipline, unpredictability with structure, warmth with distance. It worked. In business. In everything else, it left a hollow echo. Late at night, when the office emptied and the city softened, those defenses felt thinner. He could sense where they were patched together, strong but not whole. His phone rested face down on the desk behind him, screen dark, notifications silenced. There were messages waiting, invitations, proposals, requests, obligations, all the things that proved his importance to the world. None of them proved his importance to anyone personally. Rain slid in thin veins down the glass, breaking the city into fractured streaks of light. For a fleeting second, he imagined stepping away from all of it, not in escape, but in choice. Then he dismissed the thought as quickly as it came. This was his life now, achievement without attachment, influence without intimacy, movement without a rival. Still, something lingered, a faint memory of laughter in a quiet room, a hand in his, a voice that once made the skyline feel small. He didn't chase it. He simply let it pass, like the rain, acknowledging its weight without reaching for it. When the moment faded, he turned back toward the desk, the city steadying into sharp lines again. Control returned, but the absence remained. The office settled into its deepest quiet of the night. Not the kind that feels empty, the kind that feels heavy, like the air itself knows something important is being held back. Enrico returned to his desk, not hurried, not hesitant, simply deliberate. The polished surface reflected the muted glow of the city beyond the glass, broken into thin bands of light that slid slowly across the room. If you're following along and feeling this with me, hit like, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. He stood there a moment, hands resting at the edge of the table, feeling the coolness of it beneath his palms. This desk had witnessed empires rise and fall. This room had shaped policies, acquisitions, and systems that millions of people depended on daily. From here, he moved the world with a sentence, yet no contract, no merger, no technological breakthrough filled the quiet inside him. He pressed a button on the wall. The blinds descended smoothly, slicing the skyline into narrow, disciplined strips before sealing it away completely. The room dimmed, softened, became almost intimate, a stark contrast to the relentless brilliance outside. For most men, this would feel like retreat. For him, it was control. He turned toward the private elevator, the one that carried him above crowds, above inconvenience, above unpredictability. Stainless steel doors waited in perfect stillness, as if anticipating his next command. His reflection stared back at him in the polished surface. Not a tyrant, not a cold machine, not the caricature some people whispered about in business circles. Just a man who had learned to survive by closing doors others left open. He stepped forward, then stopped. A faint echo of the earlier moment brushed against his thoughts, a child's trembling voice, a wet sleeve slipping over tiny hands, eyes searching desperately for safety. He didn't linger on it, but he didn't dismiss it either. The elevator chimed softly, doors gliding open without effort. Inside, the lighting was calm, contained, entirely predictable, everything his life had become. He stepped in. As the doors slid shut, sealing him away from the office and the city he ruled, the truth remained clear, unembellished, unavoidable. Power surrounded him. Order followed him. Success defined him. And still, he had everything, except the one thing money couldn't buy. The elevator carried Enrico down in silent, measured descent. No music, no conversation, just the soft whisper of cables and the faint shift of air as floors slipped past like erased lines on a page. When the doors opened, the lobby was nearly empty. Marble gleaming, security desks dimmed, the city's pulse filtered into something distant and polite. Outside, the rain had not eased. It struck the pavement in hard, uneven beats, turning every curb into a thin, restless stream. Streetlights bent their glow across the road, stretching gold into trembling ribbons that quivered with each passing car. Vince waited exactly where he always did. Black car idling, engine low, light steady. Enrico slid into the back seat without a word. The door sealed shut with a quiet finality, cutting off the cold night in an instant. For a while, there was nothing but motion. Tires gliding over slick asphalt, windshield wipers carving rhythm through the storm, headlights painting brief tunnels of light ahead of them. Then, as they rounded a slow bend near a small park close to his building, something broke the pattern. Vince eased his foot from the accelerator. "Sir," he said, eyes flicking to the side. Enrico followed his gaze. Beneath a flickering street lamp, barely visible through sheets of rain, a tiny figure sat on a park bench. Alone. Not standing, not moving. Just folded inward, small shoulders trembling, the world far too big around her. The car rolled to a gentle stop at the curb. For a few seconds neither man spoke. Rain drummed against the roof. A bus hissed past. Somewhere a distant horn sounded and faded. Most nights, Enrico would have looked straight ahead. Most nights he would have told himself it wasn't his responsibility. Tonight, he didn't. His hand moved to the door handle. "Vince," he said quietly, without taking his eyes off the child. "Wait here." The lock clicked. Cold air rushed in as he opened the door, carrying the sharp scent of wet asphalt and electric rain. He stepped out. Umbrella unfolding above him, he crossed the street toward the lonely bench. Not hurried, not hesitant, simply certain. Rain flattened the world into thin, gleaming surfaces. Puddles reflected the street lamp in fractured gold. Leaves lay slick and motionless along the path. Wind threaded through bare branches with a low, restless breath. Enrico crossed the curb and stepped onto the park's narrow walkway. His shoes met water immediately, the cold soaking through polished leather. But he didn't slow. The little girl remained exactly where she was, curled inward, hands hidden inside sleeves too long for her arms, head bowed beneath the weight of the storm. He stopped a few feet away. Not too close, not too far. Then, slowly, deliberately, he lowered himself to her level. One knee touched the wet ground, The umbrella tilted forward, its edge shielding her from the worst of the rain while it pattered harder against his shoulder. Up close, he noticed small details, the damp strands of hair clinging to her forehead, the faint tremor in her breathing, the way her fingers tightened around the fabric of her coat. He softened his voice before he spoke. "Hey," not loud, not sharp, just steady. "Why are you crying, sweetheart?" She lifted her face. Tears had carved clean paths down her cheeks, cutting through the grime the rain had carried. Her eyes were wide, searching, uncertain, the look of a child who knows something is wrong but can't fix it. Her lips trembled before the words came out. I can't find my mommy." The answer landed quietly, but it struck him with more force than any crisis he had ever managed in a boardroom. He didn't react with alarm. He didn't fill the silence with nervous chatter. He didn't ask questions she wasn't ready to answer. Instead, he adjusted his position so she wouldn't have to look up at him. "You're safe right now," he said, calm and unhurried. "I'll stay with you." Her gaze flickered over his face, testing whether he meant it. You won't leave?" For the first time that night, his expression shifted, not into pity but into something gentler. "I won't." Rain hammered the world around them. Under the umbrella, everything grew still. The storm didn't stop. It simply lost its power over them. Rain struck the umbrella in a steady rhythm, sliding down its edges in narrow, trembling streams. Beyond that small shelter, the night remained harsh. Cars slicing through water, wind rattling the trees, the city rushing past without looking back. Inside the circle of dry air, everything felt different. Enrico eased himself onto the edge of the bench, keeping a respectful distance while making sure she wasn't alone. His coat darkened further with each passing second, but he didn't shift, didn't fidget, didn't glance at his watch. He gave her something rare in a world that never slowed down, his full presence. The little girl sniffled, her breathing still uneven, but no longer frantic. Her hands slowly slipped from her sleeves, small fingers resting on her knees instead of gripping her coat like a lifeline. She glanced at him, studying his face the way children do when they're trying to decide whether to trust someone. He met her gaze without crowding it. A faint curiosity replaced some of her fear. Her voice, when it came again, was softer, almost thoughtful. "Are you a prince?" A quiet breath left his lips. Not quite a laugh, but close. "No," he replied gently. "Just a man who happened to walk by." She tilted her head, considering him with solemn seriousness. "You talk like a kind prince." For a heartbeat, he didn't answer. Not because he didn't know what to say, but because the comment reached further into him than he expected. It touched a part of himself he rarely acknowledged, the version of him that still cared, still protected, still remembered how to be human when the world demanded efficiency. He adjusted the umbrella slightly, shielding her better as a fresh burst of rain swept across the park. Cars blurred past on the distant road. A bus hissed and vanished. Somewhere, a dog barked once and fell silent. None of it pulled his attention away. The little girl let out a small, shaky exhale, the kind that comes when fear loosens its grip. In that simple, rain-soaked pause, something quiet shifted between them, not rescue, not drama, just safety, offered and accepted. And beneath it all, beneath the storm and the city and the night, a door inside him creaked open a fraction wider than it had in years. Minutes passed the way rain does, quietly, steadily, without announcing itself. No dramatic shift marked the passage of time. There was only the soft drum of water against fabric, the distant hiss of tires, and the faint rustle of leaves bending under the weight of the storm. Enrico remained seated beside her, not rigid, not guarded, simply present. His posture carried no performance, no show of heroism, just calm endurance. The umbrella tilted slightly toward her again when a stronger gust pushed rain sideways. Water rolled down his sleeve and into his cuff unnoticed. The little girl, Adeline, though he did not yet know her name, leaned just a fraction closer to him, not touching, only enough to feel the boundary of safety he had created. Her breathing evened out. Her shoulders slowly lowered. The fear that had filled her eyes softened into something gentler, like a tide receding after a storm. She glanced around the park now, not with panic, but with quiet awareness, the way children do when they begin to believe things might be okay. A bus rumbled past in the distance. A siren sounded faintly and drifted away. Somewhere beyond the trees, laughter spilled briefly from a passing car before vanishing into the night. Life continued. Yet for them, the world narrowed to this small island of stillness beneath the umbrella. Enrico watched her carefully, not protectively in an overbearing way, but attentively, the way someone listens when something truly matters. He didn't search for her mother. He didn't shout for help. He simply stayed, because in that moment, staying was the only thing that made sense. Adeline turned her head slightly, studying his profile, the sharp line of his jaw, the steady set of his mouth, the calm in his eyes. She didn't ask another question. She didn't need to. Trust, once cracked open, doesn't always arrive with words. It settles in quieter ways, in the way a child stops shaking, in the way a stranger chooses patience over urgency, in the way two people exist together without needing anything more. Rain kept falling, but under that umbrella, something far more important was taking shape, a fragile sense of safety that neither of them would forget. The rain began to shift, not into calm, just into something less violent, as if even the storm sensed the stillness beneath the umbrella. Enrico felt it before he saw it, a subtle loosening in his chest, like a knot slowly losing its grip. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't sudden. It simply was, quiet, steady, and unfamiliar. For years he had moved through the world at a measured distance, insulated by glass walls, private elevators, and carefully controlled interactions. Every decision had been calculated. Every emotion kept behind a door he rarely opened. Yet here, on a wet park bench beside a frightened child, none of that armor felt necessary. He studied Adeline again, her small frame, her damp hair, the way her hands rested calmly on her knees now instead of trembling. She was no longer lost inside her fear. She was simply waiting for someone she loved to appear, waiting for the world to make sense again, waiting in the belief that the man beside her would not disappear. That trust settled over him like a responsibility he didn't resent. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about contracts, leverage, or outcomes. He wasn't planning, analyzing, or guarding himself. He was simply present. A distant sound drifted across the park, hurried footsteps splashing through puddles, uneven, urgent, growing closer. Adeline's head lifted. Her body shifted slightly on the bench, alert now, listening, sensing before seeing. Enrico turned his gaze toward the path, still calm, still steady, still anchored in the moment he had created with her. Rain softened against the umbrella. The street lamp flickered once, then held. The night felt poised on the edge of something about to change. He didn't stand. He didn't rush. He stayed exactly where he was, letting whatever came next arrive naturally, because in that simple act, staying, something inside him had already begun to change. Not loudly, not in a way the city would notice, but deep enough that, even if he didn't yet understand it, he would never be quite the same again. The footsteps drew nearer. A breathless voice cut through the rain, and the story, until now quiet and contained, prepared to open into something far larger than either of them could have imagined. The rain carried sound strangely. It muffled some things, distant traffic, passing voices, the low rumble of the city, yet sharpened others, like the quick splash of footsteps against wet pavement. At first it was barely noticeable, a faint rhythm breaking through the steady drum of the storm. Then it grew clearer, uneven, urgent, desperate. Adeline's head turned before Enrico's did, small body tensing in instinctive recognition of something only she could sense. Enrico followed the sound with calm attention. Beyond the edge of the park, through a curtain of rain and trembling light, a figure burst onto the path. A woman, breathless, soaked to the bone, hair plastered to her face, ran without hesitation straight toward the bench. Her shoes slipped across slick ground, water splashing up around her ankles with every frantic step. Her chest rose and fell in quick, shallow breaths. Her hands trembled at her sides. Her entire body moved with a single, consuming purpose to reach the child. "Adeline!" Her voice cracked across the park, slicing cleanly through the night. It wasn't loud for effect. It was raw with relief and fear tangled together. In that instant, everything in the scene shifted. Adeline's stillness shattered. She shot to her feet, raincoat flaring out around her as she leapt from the bench. "Mommy!" She didn't hesitate. She didn't look back. She ran. Tiny feet slapped against wet pavement as she flew toward her mother, arms already outstretched, tears forgotten, fear dissolving into something far more powerful. The woman dropped to her knees without caring about the water pooling beneath her and wrapped her daughter tightly against her chest. Rain streamed down both of them, but neither noticed. Adeline buried her face in her mother's shoulder, small hands clutching fabric like she never intended to let go again. For a few seconds, the world narrowed to nothing but that embrace. Mother and child locked together, trembling, breathing, holding, grounding each other after a moment that had nearly broken them. Enrico remained seated on the bench, still, respectful, unobtrusive. He kept the umbrella angled slightly toward them, shielding them as best he could, yet giving them the space they needed to exist in that reunion. The storm continued around them, but at the center of it, something whole had been restored. The embrace didn't loosen right away. Carissa held her daughter as if the world might try to take her again if she let go too soon. Her hands moved instinctively over Adeline's back, her arms, her hair, checking, grounding, assuring herself that she was truly here. Adeline clung just as tightly, face pressed into her mother's shoulder, small breaths shuddering in and out as the last traces of fear drained from her body. Rain soaked through both of them, but neither seemed to notice. For a brief stretch of time, nothing else existed. No park, no city, no storm, only mother and child finding each other again. Enrico stayed where he was. He did not rise, he did not step closer, he did not intrude on a moment that did not belong to him. Instead, he shifted the umbrella slightly, keeping its edge over them without drawing attention to himself. The rain slid down the fabric in steady lines, breaking against his shoulder and sleeve. Carissa finally pulled back just enough to look at her daughter's face. Her thumbs brushed away tears that had already faded, her voice low, trembling, and full of relief. "Baby, you're okay. You're here. You're safe." Adeline nodded quickly, burying herself against her again. Only then did Carissa lift her eyes. Her gaze moved past her daughter, searching, not in anger, not in accusation, but in instinctive awareness of the space around them. That was when she truly noticed him. The man on the bench, umbrella tilted toward them, coat dark with rain, posture calm, expression composed but not distant. Their eyes met across the short distance. For a second, neither spoke. Carissa's breathing was still uneven, her chest rising and falling rapidly, but something in her expression shifted, from pure panic to something steadier, something grateful. She adjusted her hold on Adeline with one arm and slowly pushed herself up to a crouch, then to her feet, careful not to lose her balance on the slick ground. Rain ran down her face and into the collar of her coat. Strands of hair clung to her cheeks. Her hands trembled faintly, not from cold, but from the weight of what had just happened. She turned fully toward him now, daughter pressed protectively to her side, and for the first time since she arrived, she spoke directly to him. Her voice, when it came, carried exhaustion, relief, and deep sincerity all at once. Rain traced thin lines down Carissa's face as she finally found her voice. She didn't rush it. She didn't perform. The words came out the way truth does, uneven, breathless, deeply felt. "Thank you. I don't even know how to thank you." Her grip tightened slightly around Adeline as she spoke, not out of fear now, but out of instinct. "I turned away for 1 second and—" Her sentence broke, not dramatically, not theatrically, simply because the weight of that single second hit her all at once. Enrico rose slowly from the bench. He did not tower over her, he did not close the distance. He simply stood, composed, steady, present, his hand lifted not in dismissal but in gentle restraint. "She's okay," he said, calm and grounded. "That's what matters." Carissa swallowed hard, eyes flickering briefly to her daughter's face, then back to him. Relief softened her expression, but something else settled there too, recognition of the kind of man he was. Her voice dropped, quieter now. "You didn't have to stay." It wasn't an accusation, it was an acknowledgement. Enrico met her gaze directly, no hesitation, no flourish. "Sometimes," he replied evenly, "doing the right thing isn't about having to." No grand speech, no heroics, just clarity. For a moment, rain and city faded into background noise. Two adults, standing in the aftermath of fear, seeing each other plainly. Carissa studied him, not like a wealthy stranger, not like a savior, but like someone measuring character in real time. She took in the soaked coat, the steady posture, the absence of impatience in his eyes. Adeline shifted beside her, small fingers curling around her mother's sleeve, then glancing up at the man who had stayed. Carissa's expression softened further. Not gratitude alone, something deeper, more thoughtful. She nodded once, slowly, as if accepting both his words and the man behind them. Rain kept falling. Cars kept passing. The park remained unchanged. Yet between them, something subtle took shape. Not spectacle, not fate. Just a quiet human connection that felt earned rather than forced. Enrico inclined his head slightly, respectful, unassuming. Carissa held his gaze a beat longer than politeness required. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The rain softened around them, not enough to change the night, only enough to let the space between them breathe. Carissa shifted Adeline slightly closer to her side, an instinctive movement that said both "You are safe" and "I am here." The little girl leaned into her without hesitation, small fingers curled around her mother's coat. Enrico lowered his umbrella just a fraction, no longer needing to shield them completely. Water beaded along the edge and slid off in quiet lines. Up close, Carissa saw him clearly for the first time. Not a headline, not a figure of wealth, not the kind of man she would ever expect to cross paths with. Just a composed stranger standing calmly in a soaked park, coat dark with rain, eyes steady and unhurried. Her gaze lingered, not in awe, not in curiosity about his status, but in careful reading of his character. She noticed the absence of impatience, the lack of spectacle, the way he treated the moment as serious rather than performative. Enrico, in turn, took in her presence without intrusion. She wasn't polished. She wasn't dazzling. She looked exactly like someone who had just run through a storm for the most precious thing in her life, exhausted, trembling, and fiercely protective. Yet there was quiet strength in her posture, a steadiness that did not need to announce itself. For a brief second, the gap between their worlds felt very small. Different lives, different struggles, same vulnerability. Adeline glanced up at Enrico again, then tugged gently at her mother's sleeve. "Mommy, he stayed with me. I can see that," she said softly. Enrico offered a small respectful nod, not deflecting gratitude but not seeking it either. Rain drummed lightly against the umbrella. A car hissed past on the wet road. Somewhere beyond the trees, a bus braked and moved on. None of it disturbed the quiet that had settled between them. Two strangers stood at the center of a shared moment neither of them had planned, grounded, present, and unexpectedly aligned. Not dramatic, not theatrical, just real. Carissa exhaled slowly, tension easing from her shoulders for the first time since she had burst into the park. Enrico remained still, anchored, unmoved by the chaos around them. For a heartbeat, the night belonged only to them. Rain slipped from the edge of Enrico's umbrella in narrow, steady lines. The chaos that had filled the park minutes earlier was gone, replaced by something quieter, the kind of stillness that comes after a crisis, when the world remembers how to breathe. Carissa finally loosened her hold on Adeline, just enough to kneel beside her and brush damp hair away from her face. "You're okay," she murmured again, softer now, not for reassurance, but for herself. Adeline nodded, eyes bright but calm, her small hand still anchored to her mother's sleeve. Carissa straightened slowly, careful on the slick ground, then turned back to Enrico. This time her gaze held no panic, only clarity. "You didn't just help her," she said, steadying her voice. "You helped me too." Enrico inclined his head slightly. He could have deflected, he could have minimized. Instead, he simply acknowledged her words with quiet respect. "I'm glad I was here," he replied. Nothing more, nothing less. A pause settled between them, not awkward, not heavy, just thoughtful. Carissa studied him again, more deliberately this time, as if seeing beyond the polished exterior. Something in his composure reminded her of exhaustion she recognized in herself, the kind that doesn't complain, but lingers. "You sound like someone who's been alone for a long time," she said gently. He hesitated, not because he felt exposed, but because the observation was too accurate to brush aside. He gave a small, almost reluctant nod. Carissa didn't press, she didn't pry. She simply offered a quiet smile that carried more understanding than words. Then maybe tonight wasn't just chance. For a beat, his expression shifted, subtle, almost imperceptible, but real. "Maybe not," he answered. Rain softened further, drifting into a lighter rhythm against the umbrella. A distant bus rolled past. The street lamp above them flickered once and steadied. Adeline shifted closer to her mother, safe again, grounded again. Carissa glanced down at her daughter, then back at Enrico, gratitude still present but now woven with something deeper, recognition, respect, and a quiet sense that this moment mattered. Enrico stood calmly beneath the umbrella, neither rushing the night nor clinging to it. Two strangers, standing in the aftermath of fear, connected by a single decision that neither of them would forget. The storm moved on. Their story did not. Morning came long before the city was ready for it. While most of New York still hid beneath closed curtains and dim streetlights, a single apartment window glowed softly on the fourth floor of a quiet building near the clinic. Inside, Carissa Klein was already awake. The alarm had never needed to ring. She moved through the small kitchen with practiced efficiency, kettle on, coffee measured, a simple breakfast laid out with care even when time was short. Every motion carried purpose, nothing wasted. The apartment was modest but clean. Photos lined the hallway wall, Adeline at different ages, a birthday cake smeared with frosting, a missing first tooth, a beach trip from years ago where the sun had been kinder than life usually was. One picture sat slightly apart from the rest, Carissa and her late husband, smiling in a moment that felt distant now but not forgotten. She didn't linger on it. She couldn't afford to. Down the hall, a small bedroom door stood ajar. Soft light spilled across the floor where Adeline slept, curled on her side, blanket tucked loosely around her. Carissa paused in the doorway for just a second longer than necessary. No sigh, no complaint, just quiet resolve. She crossed the room, brushed a few stray strands of hair from her daughter's face, and whispered so gently it barely stirred the air. "Sleep a little longer." Back in the kitchen, she tied her hair into a simple knot, checked the time again, and finished preparing for the day. There was no room for hesitation in her routine. Every minute had a place. Outside, the first bus of the morning rolled past. A delivery truck rumbled down the street. The city began its slow, inevitable awakening. Carissa gathered her bag, tucked a note beside Adeline's breakfast plate, and took one last look toward the bedroom. This was her life now. Quiet mornings, careful plans, and the unspoken promise that she would keep going no matter how heavy things felt. Not because it was easy, because there was no other option. She stepped out into the early light, locking the door behind her with a soft click. A new day had begun, and she would meet it head-on, as she always did. The clinic never slept, it only shifted. By the time Carissa arrived, the building was already humming with low, constant activity. Automatic doors slid open with a soft hiss, releasing a wash of antiseptic air and muted conversation. She greeted the receptionist with a brief, steady nod before moving quickly toward the staff area. Her steps were efficient, practiced, unhurried in appearance even when time pressed against her. In the locker room, she changed without lingering, folding her jacket neatly into her bag and slipping on her uniform with quiet familiarity. Her name tag, Carissa Klein, clipped cleanly to her chest. Moments later, she was on the floor. Fluorescent lights glowed overhead. Monitors beeped softly. The scent of cleaning solution hung faintly in the air. Patients moved in and out of rooms on rolling stretchers, some tired, some anxious, some painfully hopeful. Carissa moved among them like a steady current. She adjusted pillows without being asked. She held hands when words felt insufficient. She explained procedures in calm, simple terms that made frightened faces relax. An elderly man in room 214 squeezed her wrist and whispered, "Thank you." She offered a small, warm smile and kept going. A young mother struggled to soothe a feverish toddler. Carissa knelt beside them, speaking gently, helping her find the right position, never making her feel like a burden. No one called her a hero. She didn't need them to. She simply did her job, fully, patiently, humanly. In quieter moments, she checked charts, sanitized equipment, and coordinated with nurses twice her age who respected her because she never cut corners. Her body grew tired long before her attention did. Still, she stayed present. At lunch, she sat alone in the break room, staring briefly at her phone, a picture of Adeline from that morning lighting up the screen, before setting it face down again. There was too much to do to drift. When the afternoon rush hit, she met it without complaint, because caring for others was not just work to her, it was how she kept moving forward. By the time evening shadows stretched across the hallway floors, her feet ached, her shoulders burned, but her focus never wavered. She finished her final rounds, exchanged a few quiet words with her coworkers, and signed out with a steady hand. Outside, the city had shifted again, louder now, brighter, more impatient. Carissa stepped into it without hesitation. There was still someone waiting for her at home. Evening wrapped itself around the city like a slow breath. Streetlights flickered on one by one. Traffic thickened, windows glowed with fragments of other people's lives. Somewhere music drifted faintly through open balconies, then faded again. Carissa rode the bus home, shoulders heavy, eyes steady. She didn't close them. She watched the streets pass. Familiar corners, familiar faces, familiar exhaustion, as if staying alert helped her keep control over everything she carried. When she reached her building, the stairwell lights buzzed softly overhead. Her key turned in the lock with a small, practiced twist. The door opened to warmth, quiet, and the scent of simple dinner waiting on the stove. "Mommy." Adeline appeared in the hallway before Carissa could even set her bag down, small arms wrapping tightly around her waist. Carissa bent instantly, pulling her close. "I'm here," she said, not loudly, just firmly. Dinner was simple. Plates were cleared, dishes rinsed, no ceremony, just routine that kept their world steady. Afterward, bathwater ran, then quieted. A towel wrapped around small shoulders. Pajamas slid on with sleepy protests. Toothbrushes moved in gentle circles while Carissa hummed under her breath. In Adeline's bedroom, a single lamp cast a soft glow across the walls. The bed creaked lightly as Carissa sat beside her, tucking the blanket carefully around her daughter's shoulders. She brushed damp hair back from Adeline's forehead, her touch tender but unhurried. For a moment, silence rested between them, not empty, but full. Then, as she always did, Carissa leaned close and whispered, clear and steady, "We'll be okay, I promise." It wasn't a magical phrase. It wasn't naive. It was a vow built from long days, harder nights, and a determination that had never broken. Adeline's eyelids fluttered. "Stay a little," she murmured. "Just a minute," Carissa replied. She remained there, hand resting gently on her daughter's back, feeling each slow breath rise and fall until sleep settled fully. Only then did she stand. At the doorway she glanced back once more, at the small figure curled beneath the blanket, safe, warm, breathing evenly. Carissa turned off the light. The apartment grew quiet. Another day had ended. Another one would begin, and she would meet it the same way she always had, steady, uncomplaining, and unwavering. After Adeline fell asleep, the apartment felt different, quieter, smaller, heavier. Carissa moved back into the living room and sat for a moment at the edge of the couch, hands resting loosely in her lap. The television was off. The kitchen light still glowed softly down the hallway. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence like a low, steady heartbeat. She didn't collapse into tears. She didn't scream into a pillow. She simply sat, still composed, holding everything inside the way she always did. Her gaze drifted to the photograph on the side table, her and her husband years earlier, laughing at something only they remembered, his arm around her shoulders, her head tilted toward him without hesitation. She looked at it just long enough to remember, not to relive. Then she looked away. Grief for Carissa was not dramatic. It was quiet, persistent, woven into ordinary moments. It lived in the empty chair at the dinner table, in the way she handled problems alone, in the way she learned to make decisions twice as carefully because there was no one else to share them with. She stood slowly and began her nighttime routine. Bag checked, clothes laid out for the morning, dishes rinsed and stacked neatly in the sink, windows locked, lights dimmed. Each task was small. Together they kept her moving. In the bathroom, she caught a reflection in the mirror. Tired eyes, pulled back hair, a face that had learned resilience the hard way. She didn't look at herself with self-pity, only with honesty. Yes, she was exhausted. Yes, she missed him. Yes, life was harder than she ever imagined, but she was still standing, and that mattered. Before bed, she stepped quietly into Adeline's room once more. The little girl slept peacefully, blanket rising and falling with each slow breath. Carissa lingered just long enough to feel grounded again. Then she returned to her own room, switched off the lamp, and lay down in the dark. Sleep didn't come instantly. Her mind replayed moments from the day, patience, deadlines, worries, plans for tomorrow. And beneath it all, the same unspoken truth she lived with every day. She was doing this alone, but she was doing it, and that, for now, had to be enough. Rain tapped softly against the bedroom window as Carissa lay awake. The apartment was dark now, wrapped in the kind of hush that settles only after a long day finally loosens its grip. The clock on the nightstand glowed faintly, numbers ticking forward without apology. She turned onto her side, eyes resting on the faint outline of the doorway. For a moment, her thoughts drifted back to the park, not with panic, not with regret, with clarity. She replayed small details in her mind, the steady umbrella above her daughter, the calm man who never rushed, the way Adeline had looked when she said, "Mommy, he stayed with me." Carissa exhaled slowly. In a life where she had grown used to doing everything alone, that simple act, a stranger choosing to remain, lingered in a way she hadn't expected. She didn't romanticize it. She didn't turn it into a fantasy. She simply recognized what it meant. Someone had stepped in when she needed help, without judgment, without expectation, without spectacle. That was rare. She pushed herself up slightly, resting on her elbow, and glanced toward Adeline's room down the hall. A faint sliver of light still slipped beneath the door, just enough to remind her that her daughter was safe. Her chest tightened, not with fear this time, but with gratitude. Carissa lowered herself back onto the pillow. Her mind moved forward again, to early mornings, long shifts, bills to pay, routines to keep, promises to uphold. Nothing about her life had magically changed. She would still wake before dawn. She would still work until her feet ached. She would still carry more responsibility than most people her age. But something inside her felt different, not lighter, just steadier, like she'd been reminded that the world, harsh as it could be, was not entirely indifferent. Outside, the rain softened into a gentle patter. Inside, Carissa finally let her eyes close. Sleep arrived quietly, not rushing, not dragging, simply settling in once she allowed it. In the room down the hall, Adeline shifted and breathed. In the city beyond their windows, millions of lives moved on. And in that small apartment, a single mother drifted into rest with one unspoken truth anchored firmly in her heart. She was still doing this alone, but she did not have to believe that no one would ever choose to stay. The storm had finally moved on. Puddles still gleamed along the sidewalks, catching the amber glow of streetlights, but the air felt lighter, washed clean, sharper, almost fragile. The park was quieter now than it had been minutes earlier. Traffic rolled past in a smoother rhythm. Leaves hung heavy with water. The flickering street lamp above the bench burned steady. Carissa stood beside Adeline, one hand resting protectively on her daughter's shoulder, the other tucked close to her own body, as if she were still gathering herself. Enrico remained near the bench, umbrella lowered, rain dripping slowly from its edge in thin, even lines. For a moment no one spoke. The silence was not awkward. It was the kind that follows a crisis, measured, thoughtful, and strangely intimate. Adeline shifted closer to her mother, then glanced up at Enrico again, studying him with the same quiet curiosity she had shown earlier. He met her gaze calmly, offering a small, reassuring nod. Carissa watched that exchange out of the corner of her eye. When she finally spoke again, her voice carried less urgency, steadier now, grounded. "You didn't just help her," she said, not rushing the words. "You helped me too." There was no drama in it, no exaggeration, just honest recognition. Enrico inclined his head slightly. "I'm glad I was here," he replied, simple, composed, unpretentious. Rain still clung to his coat, darkening the fabric along his shoulders and sleeves. His posture remained relaxed, yet attentive, the kind of stillness that made people feel seen without feeling observed. Carissa let out a slow breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Her eyes searched his face again, not for status, not for answers, but for understanding. She saw something familiar there, exhaustion worn quietly, not loudly. Her tone softened. "You sound like someone who's been alone for a long time." The statement hung gently between them, not a challenge, not sympathy, just truth spoken carefully. Enrico hesitated only briefly, not because he felt exposed, but because the observation struck close. He gave a small, almost reluctant nod. Carissa didn't press. She didn't pry. She simply offered a faint, thoughtful smile that carried more empathy than words ever could. Outside the park, a bus rolled past. A distant car horn sounded once and faded. Inside that quiet pocket of night, something subtle settled between them. Not destiny, not romance, just the first thread of genuine human recognition. The rain had thinned to a soft, scattered patter. It no longer hammered the night, only brushed it, as if the storm itself were easing away to give them space. Adeline shifted her weight beside her mother, fingers still curled loosely around Carissa's sleeve. Her breathing was calm now, her earlier fear fully drained from her small frame. Enrico remained exactly where he was, umbrella resting at his side, water tracing slow lines down its edge. Carissa studied him again, more deliberately than before, not searching for answers, but weighing something unspoken. Her voice, when she spoke, was quieter. "You didn't look away." It wasn't phrased as gratitude or accusation. It was simply an observation that carried more meaning than it appeared to. Enrico considered her words for a brief second. "I almost did," he admitted, without dramatics. "Old habits." Carissa didn't smile. She didn't pity him. She simply nodded, as if she understood what that meant more than he expected. A distant car hissed past on the wet road. Wind moved gently through the trees overhead, sending a few heavy drops slipping from the leaves. For a moment, neither of them filled the space with unnecessary talk. Then Carissa tilted her head slightly, thoughtful. "You don't feel like someone who belongs only to glass buildings and empty offices." His mouth curved just enough to be noticed. "That's not a compliment I hear often." Her expression softened, not in amusement but in recognition. "And you don't feel like someone who's used to people staying," he added calmly, not pressing, simply stating what he sensed. She let out a quiet breath, not a sigh, just truth escaping. "Staying hasn't been easy for most people in my life." The words landed gently, without bitterness. Rain slipped from the edge of the umbrella. Somewhere beyond the park, a bus braked and moved on. Carissa glanced down at Adeline, then back at him. "Maybe tonight wasn't random," she said after a beat, steady, unforced. "Maybe not." Neither of them tried to define what that meant. They didn't need to. In that small, rain-washed pocket of the city, two strangers stood a little less alone than they had been minutes earlier. Connected not by circumstance, but by a shared moment of stillness that felt rare and real. The night exhaled around them. Their conversation, just beginning, did not. A faint breeze moved through the park, lifting a few loose strands of Carissa's hair from her face. She tucked them behind her ear without looking away from Enrico. The motion was simple, unguarded, the kind people make when they feel steady enough not to perform. Adeline shifted closer, leaning lightly against her mother's leg. Carissa rested her hand on her daughter's shoulder without looking down, instinctively anchoring her to the moment. Enrico watched that small, effortless gesture, not as an outsider, as someone quietly taking in how care looked when it wasn't loud. He folded his umbrella slightly, water slipping from the fabric in thin, quiet lines. The night felt less crowded now, less harsh, as if it were making room for something slower. Carissa spoke again, not rushing, not overthinking. "You didn't ask too many questions." He tilted his head just enough to acknowledge her point. "I figured there would be time for that later," he replied calmly. Right then, she just needed someone to stay. Carissa's expression softened further. "That tells me more about you than anything you could have said." A small pause settled between them, not heavy, not empty, just thoughtful. Enrico glanced briefly toward the path where she had come running minutes earlier, then back to her. "You didn't panic," he observed, gentle, not accusatory. She let out a quiet breath. "I did," she admitted, honest. "Just not in front of her." Adeline looked up at her mother at that, eyes bright with trust. Carissa squeezed her shoulder lightly in response. For a moment the three of them existed in a quiet alignment, not together, not separate, simply present in the same breath of night. Rain continued to fall in scattered drops. A distant bus rolled past. Somewhere beyond the trees, laughter spilled briefly from a passing car and faded. Enrico's gaze returned to Carissa. "There are people who move through the world like they've never had to carry anything alone," he said evenly. "You don't feel like one of them." She considered that, then gave a small, wry breath that wasn't quite a laugh. "That's because I haven't had that option. No bitterness, no complaint, just fact." He nodded once, slow, respectful. Silence rested between them again, but this time it felt less like aftermath and more like beginning. Two people, careful with their words, steady with their presence, realizing, without saying it, that this chance meeting had already lingered longer than most ever would. The night stretched on. Their quiet exchange did not end. The rain softened again, thinning into scattered droplets that tapped lightly against leaves and pavement. The park felt different now, not dramatic, just quieter, as if the world had decided to slow its pace around them. Carissa adjusted her stance, shifting her weight slightly as Adeline leaned more fully against her leg. The little girl's earlier tension had melted completely. Her body was relaxed, grounded, secure in her mother's presence. Enrico rested his umbrella against the edge of the bench, no longer needing to shield them. Water pooled briefly along its rim before sliding away. He studied the space between them rather than staring directly at Carissa, not out of distance, but out of respect for the moment they were sharing. She spoke first this time, voice calm, measured, thoughtful. "I don't usually talk like this with strangers." There was no apology in it, only truth. He inclined his head slightly. "Neither do I." A small pause followed, not awkward, simply real. Carissa glanced briefly toward the path that led out of the park, then back to him, as if weighing whether to say something more. When she did, her words came slowly. "If this story is making you think about your own life, leave a comment and tell me what part is touching you most. And make sure you're subscribed. Most people don't stay long enough to have a conversation." It wasn't bitterness, it wasn't complaint, it was quiet experience. Enrico absorbed that without interruption. Rain traced faint lines down his coat sleeve unnoticed. "I've spent years being very good at leaving," he admitted, even unadorned. "Tonight, I didn't." Her gaze softened, not in sympathy, but in understanding. Adeline tilted her head back, looking up at her mother, then at Enrico again, as if sensing something shifting beneath the surface of the night. Carissa's hand moved gently along her daughter's shoulder in a steady rhythm, reassurance without words. The wind stirred the trees overhead, sending a few heavy drops falling in soft, uneven beats. For a moment, none of them spoke, not because they had nothing to say, but because the silence itself carried meaning. Then Carissa turned back to him, her voice quieter now, but steady. Maybe tonight wasn't just chance. He met her eyes fully this time, not with certainty, not with promises, just openness. Maybe not, no grand realization followed, no sweeping conclusion. Only two people, standing beneath a clearing sky, recognizing, without announcing it, that something had quietly changed for both of them. The city moved beyond the park. Inside it, the night lingered a little longer, and their conversation, still gentle, still careful, prepared to move into its final turn. The last of the rain drifted away, not in a sudden break, just a gentle thinning, as if the night itself had decided the storm had done its work. The park felt wider now, lighter, less crowded by fear. Adeline shifted again beside her mother, small fingers loosening from Carissa's sleeve. She looked up at Enrico once more, studying him with the same quiet certainty she had shown earlier, the kind children carry when they sense steadiness in another person. He met her gaze calmly, offering a small, unspoken assurance. Carissa noticed. She didn't comment on it. She simply held the moment. Her hand rested easily on Adeline's shoulder, no longer gripping, no longer bracing, just present. Her breathing had slowed. The tension that had lived in her posture since she arrived had softened into something steadier. She turned back to Enrico. For a brief second, neither of them spoke. Then she did, voice even, thoughtful, sincere. "Thank you." Again, not dramatic, not embellished, just honest. He inclined his head slightly. "You don't need to thank me twice." Her expression shifted, not into a smile exactly, but into something warmer, more grounded. "I probably will anyway," she replied softly. Adeline looked between them, sensing the unspoken ease that had formed, even if she didn't understand it. Beyond the park, a bus rolled past. Somewhere in the distance, a car door closed with a muted thud. The city resumed its rhythm, indifferent to the small pocket of connection it had briefly hosted. Carissa glanced down at her daughter, then back to Enrico. "We should head home," she said, practical, gentle, certain. He nodded once, not pushing, not lingering. Of course, for a moment they stood there, two adults who had met under extraordinary circumstances, yet were parting in a way that felt remarkably ordinary. Not rushed, not forced, simply complete. Carissa took Adeline's hand, fingers intertwining naturally. She turned toward the path, then paused just long enough to look back once more. Their eyes met again. No promises, no declarations, no spectacle, only quiet recognition, the kind that stays with you long after the night has ended. Enrico watched as mother and daughter moved down the path, their figures slowly blending into the softened glow of the streetlights. He remained still beneath the empty sky, umbrella resting at his side. The storm was gone, the moment had passed, and yet, in a way neither of them could fully name, something between them had just begun. The street was quieter now, rain reduced to faint streaks along the curb. Vince stepped out of the car as soon as he saw Carissa and Adeline approaching, opening the rear door with calm professionalism. He didn't stare, he didn't ask questions, he simply did his job. Enrico walked a few steps toward them, umbrella still in hand. "If you'll allow it," he said evenly, "I can have my driver take you home. No pressure, no performance, just an offer." Carissa hesitated, not out of suspicion but caution. Her hand tightened briefly around Adeline's before loosening again. She glanced at her daughter's damp coat, at her own soaked clothes, at the quiet street around them. Adeline looked up at her, eyes still bright but tired. Carissa met Enrico's gaze. "Only if it isn't out of your way." "It isn't," he replied simply. "That's settled it." Vince opened the door wider. Carissa guided Adeline inside first, making sure she was secure before sliding in beside her. The leather seats were warm, dry, and steady, a sharp contrast to the cold night outside. Enrico took the opposite seat, leaving space between them without awkwardness. The door closed with a soft, solid click. Inside the car, the world narrowed into quiet. The engine purred. Windshield wipers moved in slow, steady arcs. Streetlights slid past in smooth, amber streaks. No one spoke at first. Adeline leaned lightly against her mother, eyelids growing heavy now that the fear had fully passed. Carissa rested a hand on her shoulder, thumb moving in a gentle rhythm. After a few minutes, Carissa spoke quietly. "Thank you. For this, too." He turned his head slightly toward her. "It's nothing," he said. "Not dismissive, just factual." Vince navigated the streets with practiced ease, taking turns without hesitation, slowing smoothly at lights, never rushing. The car slipped through the rain-washed city like a calm pocket moving through chaos. When they finally reached Carissa's building, the vehicle slowed to a stop at the curb. Vince stepped out first, opening the door without being asked. Enrico waited, respectful, composed, unintrusive. Carissa gathered Adeline carefully in her arms, still half asleep, and turned back to him one last time before stepping out. The night had changed for all of them, quietly, without spectacle. And this simple ride home was the first sign that their worlds, once separate, had begun to overlap. The following morning, Enrico returned to his office before sunrise. The city was quieter then, not asleep, just subdued, and the glass walls of its corner suite reflected a softer version of New York than the one that ruled his nights. Naomi was already at her desk when he stepped off the elevator. She looked up, curious, then composed her expression in an instant. If she noticed anything different about him, she didn't say so. Enrico walked straight to his desk and sat down. For a few moments, he reviewed reports, emails, and schedules with his usual precision. His posture was the same. His tone, when he spoke into his headset, was measured and clear. Yet his attention kept drifting, not to numbers, but to a small park bench slick with rain, a trembling child beneath an umbrella, and a breathless mother running through puddles. He set his pen down. "Naomi," he said calmly. She looked up immediately. "I need you to arrange something." He spoke without revealing aims or details, but his instructions were specific. Updated diagnostic equipment, additional supplies for a small neighborhood clinic, priority delivery within 48 hours, no mention of his company's name beyond standard documentation, no donation announcement, no press release, no photograph, just action. Naomi listened carefully, fingers moving across her tablet. When he finished, she hesitated for half a second, unusual for her, then nodded. "It will be done." Enrico leaned back in his chair, gaze drifting to the skyline beyond the glass. He could have written a check. He could have called in favors. He could have made a public gesture. He chose none of that. He wanted the help to land quietly, without spectacle, without putting anyone in a position of gratitude they didn't ask for. Later that day, as delivery trucks rolled through traffic toward a modest clinic across town, Carissa moved through her shift unaware that anything had changed. She adjusted pillows. She reassured patients. She wiped down equipment that had seen better days. She had no idea that new machines, faster, safer, more reliable, were already on their way. And Enrico, back in his glass office, did not call to check. He did not ask for confirmation beyond a simple message that the delivery was scheduled. He returned to his work. Meetings resumed. Decisions were made. The city kept moving beneath him, Yet something in his routine felt subtly different, not louder, not lighter, just more purposeful. He had not crossed a boundary. He had simply extended the same calm presence he had offered in the rain, this time in a way only he would ever truly see. And somewhere across the city, two worlds that had once been separate were beginning, quietly, to touch. 2 days later, the clinic felt different. Not in a dramatic way, just in small, undeniable details that made Carissa pause. She arrived at her usual time, uniform pressed, hair tied back, mind already moving through the list of patients she would see before noon. The automatic doors slid open. The first thing she noticed was the sound. Quieter, smoother, less strained. Then she noticed the room itself. New equipment sat where older machines had been the day before, clean, modern, clearly not patched together from spare parts and budget cuts. The monitors were sharper. The pumps ran with steadier precision. Even the examination beds looked sturdier. A nurse from the next shift glanced at her, eyebrows raised. "Big upgrades," she said simply. Carissa set her bag down slowly, eyes moving across the floor, taking it all in. No announcement had been made. No plaque hung on the wall. No donor's name appeared anywhere. Just change. The clinic director approached, calm but clearly pleased. "Delivery came this morning," he said. "No details about who funded it, just paperwork and installation." Carissa nodded, professional, but something stirred beneath her composure. As she moved through her rounds, she felt the difference everywhere. Patients were processed faster. Anxiety levels dropped. One elderly woman squeezed her hand and said, "This machine feels gentler today." Carissa offered her usual small smile, but her thoughts kept circling back. Later, in a quieter moment between rooms, she stood near a window that overlooked the street. Delivery trucks had already gone. The city moved as it always did. She thought of a park bench in the rain, a steady umbrella, a man who had stayed. She didn't assume, she didn't jump to conclusions, but she recognized a familiar pattern, help offered without fanfare, without strings, without forcing gratitude into the open. That kind of kindness was rare. Carissa returned to work, more focused than before. Yet beneath her efficiency ran a quiet awareness something had shifted beyond the walls of her apartment, beyond the limits of her routine. Across town, in a glass office high above the skyline, Enrico sat in a meeting he barely remembered. His mind wasn't on contracts. It rested, briefly and without indulgence, on a small clinic where a single mother moved through long hallways with steady grace, and where, for reasons only he knew, the tools in her hands were a little better today. 2 separate lives, one quiet bridge forming between them, and neither of them spoke of it. That evening, Carissa did not hurry home the way she usually did. Her shift had ended, her tasks completed, but she lingered for a few minutes in the quiet hallway outside the clinic. The new machines hummed softly behind closed doors, their steady rhythm settling into the building like something that had always belonged there. She stood by a tall window and watched the street below. Cars slid past in slow traffic. Pedestrians crossed beneath glowing lights. The city moved the way it always did, busy, indifferent, unstoppable. Yet her mind was not on the city. It was back in the park, not in a dramatic way, not in longing, just in careful recollection. She remembered the way he had knelt without hesitation, the calm in his voice when Adeline trembled, the space he gave her when she arrived, the absence of impatience when most men in his position would have already left. Carissa folded her arms loosely across her chest, not to shield herself, but to steady her thoughts. She didn't romanticize him. She didn't imagine a fairy tale. She simply noticed something rare. He had acted like a man who understood responsibility without needing applause for it. As she stepped outside, the night air felt cooler, cleaner than before. She walked toward the bus stop at her usual pace, practical, grounded, unhurried. On the ride home, she stared out the window at passing storefronts, street lamps, and familiar corners. Adeline's school came into view, then disappeared again. Her thoughts drifted back once more, not to wealth, not to status, to steadiness, to presence, to the way some people show up quietly and change the tone of a moment without ever seeking credit. When she reached her building, she climbed the stairs, unlocked the door, and stepped into warmth and routine. Dinner, homework, bath, bedtime, all moving in their familiar rhythm. Yet as she sat beside Adeline that night, brushing hair back from her daughter's forehead, her mind returned one last time to the man beneath the umbrella. She didn't tell anyone. She didn't search for him. She simply carried the thought with her, calm, unforced, persistent. Across the city, high above glowing streets, Enrico glanced briefly at his darkened phone before setting it aside. He, too, did not linger. But like Carissa, he did not forget. 2 people, in separate rooms, carrying the same quiet awareness. Their meeting had not ended in the rain. It had only begun. Night settled across New York in different ways for different people. In Carissa's apartment, the lights dimmed one by one. The television clicked off. The kitchen sink held a few rinsed dishes waiting for morning. Down the hall, Adeline slept soundly beneath her blanket, breath slow and even. Carissa moved quietly through the living room, locking windows, checking the door, then finally sitting for a brief moment on the edge of the couch. She didn't collapse. She didn't vent. She simply rested, back straight, hands folded loosely in her lap, eyes focused on nothing in particular. Her thoughts brushed once again against the memory of that night in the park, not with longing, not with fantasy, with clarity. She had met many people in her life, some kind, some careless, some self-absorbed. The man beneath the umbrella had felt different, not because of who he was, but because of how he had acted. That awareness stayed with her as she turned off the final lamp and slipped into bed. Across the city, lights glowed behind the glass walls of Enrico's office. Most of his team had gone home. The floor was quiet. The skyline outside was a field of distant, trembling points of light. He stood by the window for a moment, not brooding, not lost, simply thoughtful. His phone rested face down on the desk behind him. His calendar was full. His inbox was relentless. His responsibilities were unchanged. Yet something in his routine felt slightly different. He wasn't thinking about deals. He was thinking about a small clinic that now had better equipment than it did 2 days ago, and a woman who would never know he had been the reason. He didn't frame it as generosity, just alignment with the choice he had made in the rain. When he finally turned away from the window, he moved with the same composure he always had, measured, controlled, deliberate. But beneath it, a subtle shift remained. 2 separate lives, 2 separate nights, and between them, a quiet line of connection that had begun with a child on a bench and was now woven gently into both of their worlds. Enrico stepped into his private elevator. Carissa closed her eyes in a darkened bedroom. The city carried on around them. Their paths, however, were no longer completely parallel. They had touched, quietly, meaningfully, and that touch had changed the direction of both. 2 weeks later, the rain returned, lighter this time, almost polite. It brushed the sidewalks instead of pounding them, leaving behind a faint sheen that made the city look freshly cleaned. Carissa had finished her morning shift early, a rare pocket of free time appearing where none usually existed. She hesitated for only a moment, then decided not to rush straight home. Instead, she turned into a small cafe near the clinic, the kind of place that smelled like warm bread and strong coffee, where people spoke in low voices and didn't mind being alone together. She ordered a simple black coffee and took a seat by the window. Outside, pedestrians moved beneath umbrellas. A delivery truck idled at the curb. The familiar rhythm of the neighborhood rolled past. She just lifted her cup when the bell above the door chimed. Carissa didn't look up at first. Then she did. Enrico stood just inside the entrance, shaking a few drops of rain from his umbrella before folding it neatly. He wasn't in a suit today. Only a well-tailored coat over a simple shirt, his presence quieter than it had been in the park, but no less steady. For a split second, neither of them moved. Recognition landed quietly, not with shock, just with clarity. He noticed her first. His gaze shifted from the counter to the window, and when it met hers, something subtle softened in his expression. He gave a small, respectful nod. She returned it, lifting her coffee slightly. Not a wave, just acknowledgement. He ordered quickly, no fuss, no performance, then turned and crossed the room toward her table. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, calm, unassuming. Carissa glanced at the empty chair opposite her, then back at him. "Go ahead." He settled into the seat with measured ease, coat folded neatly over the back of the chair. Their coffees rested between them like neutral ground. For a moment, neither spoke. Rain traced thin lines down the window beside them. Finally, Carissa broke the silence. Not rushed, not awkward, just natural. He didn't look like a cafe person. A faint, genuine smile touched his mouth. "I'm not," he admitted, "but I needed to slow down for 10 minutes. She studied him briefly, then nodded, understanding more than she said. He looked out the window, then back at her. Her expression softened instantly. "Better than I was that night. No dramatics, no embellishment, just truth." Outside, the rain kept falling in gentle, steady beats. Inside, 2 people who had met in crisis began, quietly, to choose conversation. They did not sit in the cafe long. When their cups were empty, neither of them felt the need to linger. They rose almost at the same time, unspoken, unforced, and stepped back into the soft rain together. The sidewalk was slick but calm, water gathering in shallow channels along the curb. Cars rolled past without urgency. The neighborhood felt quieter than usual, as if it had softened to match their pace. Enrico held his umbrella low, not hovering, not distant, simply steady. Carissa walked beside him, hands tucked lightly into the pockets of her coat, posture relaxed in a way that felt new. They didn't rush. They didn't fill the space with pointless talk. Their steps fell into an easy rhythm, the kind of silence that doesn't feel empty, only comfortable. After a block, Carissa spoke, voice casual. "I usually don't have time for slow mornings." He glanced at her briefly. Neither do I. A faint, almost amused breath left her lips. So we're both trespassing on our own routines. He considered that for a moment, then nodded once. Seems like it. They reached a small park. Not the one from that night, but another, quieter, bordered by trees that still held beads of rain along their leaves. A few joggers passed in the distance. A dog barked once and then fell silent. They walked along a narrow path side by side. Carissa watched her steps, then looked ahead again. You didn't have to upgrade the clinic, she said. Not accusing, not thanking, just stating. He didn't pretend ignorance. I didn't do it for recognition. She stopped walking for a half second, then matched his pace again. I know. No argument followed. No emotional speech. Just mutual understanding. A small smile touched her face. Not dramatic, just real. You move quietly, she added. He let out a soft breath that wasn't quite a laugh. I've had practice. They rounded a bend in the path, passing beneath overhanging branches that dripped occasional drops onto the umbrella. For a moment the world narrowed to their footsteps and the gentle patter above them. Carissa glanced at him again. You asked about Adeline. Her expression softened. She asked about you. That made him pause, only for a fraction of a second. Then he nodded, slow, thoughtful. They didn't turn back. They kept walking, side by side, conversation drifting naturally between them, neither pressing, neither retreating. Outside the park, the city moved at its usual speed. A quiet pattern was beginning to form, not loud, not obvious, just steady. A few days later, they found themselves in the same place without having planned it. The schoolyard buzzed with late afternoon energy, children laughing, backpacks bouncing, teachers guiding lines of small, restless bodies toward the gates. Parents gathered along the sidewalk in loose clusters, some chatting, some scrolling through their phones, some simply watching. Carissa stood near the front, hands folded loosely in front of her, eyes scanning the doors. Enrico arrived quietly. No entourage, no fanfare. Just him, umbrella folded beneath his arm, coat neat, presence steady. He didn't step too close. He didn't hover. He simply took his place a few feet to her right, close enough to share the moment, far enough to respect her space. For a beat, neither spoke. Then Carissa glanced at him sideways. You're early. He followed her gaze toward the school doors. I finished my last meeting sooner than expected. She nodded, not impressed, not dismissive, just accepting. A teacher's whistle pierced the air. A burst of excited chatter spilled from the building as the first group of children emerged. Carissa's posture shifted immediately, attention sharpening. When Adeline finally appeared, her face lit up before she even saw her mother. Mommy! Carissa crouched instantly, arms opening wide. Adeline barreled into them with the kind of joy that makes the day feel worthwhile. Only then did she notice Enrico. Her eyes widened. She slipped out of her mother's embrace just long enough to point. Mommy, it's Mr. Kindman. A few parents nearby glanced over, curious. Enrico's mouth curved, not into a performance, but into something genuine. He crouched slowly to Adeline's level, keeping his voice soft. Hello, Adeline. She studied him seriously, then nodded, satisfied. You kept your promise, she said, as if that settled everything. I did, he replied calmly. Carissa watched the exchange with quiet warmth, something easing in her expression. When she straightened again, she looked at him, not surprised, just thoughtful. They walked together toward the corner where the sidewalk widened, Adeline between them now, chattering freely about her day. Halfway there, Carissa spoke, casual but sincere. You're good with her. He didn't pretend modesty. I'm careful with her. She glanced at him, considering that distinction. Adeline skipped ahead for a moment, then turned back, small hand reaching for both of theirs without hesitation. Enrico hesitated only briefly, then accepted it. Carissa noticed. She didn't comment, but something in her softened just a little more. Outside the gates, life moved at its usual pace. Between them, something steadier was forming. Not loud, not rushed, simply real. They began to talk more, not in long confessions, but in steady, unforced exchanges that lingered after the moment ended. One late afternoon, they walked together along a tree-lined path near Adeline's school, while she played a few steps ahead, carefully balancing along the edge of the sidewalk. Enrico kept his pace slow, hands loose at his sides, posture relaxed in a way few people ever saw. Carissa spoke without looking at him. You don't act like someone with your kind of life. He glanced briefly toward the city skyline in the distance, then back ahead. Maybe that's because I don't feel like I have the life people think I do. No bitterness, no self-pity, just quiet truth. Adeline paused ahead of them, crouching to examine something on the ground. A fallen leaf, a small rock, something ordinary that felt important to her. Carissa watched her for a second, then turned back to him. After a beat, she asked gently, not probing, simply curious, how do you stay so controlled all the time? He considered the question longer than most people would have. "I don't," he replied finally. "I just don't show it." She let out a soft breath that wasn't quite a laugh. "That sounds exhausting." A faint, almost rueful smile touched his mouth. "It can be." They walked a few more steps, in silence, comfortable, unstrained. Then he turned the question back to her, voice calm, respectful. "How do you stay so strong, Carissa?" She didn't hesitate. "I don't always feel strong," she said plainly. "I just don't have the luxury of giving up." The words landed quietly. No drama, no performance, just reality. Enrico slowed slightly, absorbing them. He didn't respond immediately. He didn't need to. Those two sentences stayed with him long after they reached the corner and parted ways. Later that night, alone in his office, he would remember the way she had said it, steady, uncomplaining, certain. Adeline ran back toward them then, leaf held proudly in her hand. "Look, Mommy!" Carissa crouched instantly, eyes lighting up, attention fully present. Enrico watched them, not as an outsider, but as someone beginning to understand a different kind of strength than the one he had built his life around. When they straightened again, they resumed walking. Not rushed, not cautious, simply together in the easy rhythm they had quietly formed. Outside, the city moved at full speed. Between them, something slower, steadier, and more meaningful was taking shape. Evening started to look different for both of them. In Carissa's apartment, the routine remained the same. Dinner, homework, bath, bedtime, but the energy inside it felt quieter, steadier. Adeline spoke about Mr. Enrico, the way children talk about people they trust. Casually, confidently, without hesitation. "Mommy, do you think he'll come again?" she asked one night, swinging her legs lightly from the edge of the couch. Carissa didn't rush her answer. "Maybe," she said simply, "if our paths cross." Adeline accepted that without disappointment. For Carissa, the shift was subtler. She didn't wait for him. She didn't plan around him. She simply noticed, in small moments, that she felt less alone than she had before. Across the city, Enrico's nights changed too. He still worked late. He still stood by his office windows and watched the skyline burn gold beneath him. The elevator still carried him above the crowd. But now, he left earlier more often than he used to. Not for meetings, not for obligations, for walks near Adeline's school, for brief coffee stops, for moments that had nothing to do with profit or power. Naomi noticed. She didn't comment, but she adjusted his schedule just a little more carefully. One afternoon, as he stepped into the elevator, he paused longer than usual before pressing the button. His reflection looked back at him. Same suit, same composure, same control. Yet something beneath it had softened, not weakened, changed. Meanwhile, Adeline's affection for him grew naturally, without pressure. At first she called him Mr. Kind Man, then simply Mr. Enrico. One evening, as Carissa tied her shoes by the door, Adeline tilted her head thoughtfully. "Mommy, I like him." Carissa froze for a half-second, then straightened. "Why is that?" "Because he makes you smile." Carissa tried to brush it off. A light laugh, a gentle shake of her head. But she knew her daughter was right. She did smile more when Enrico was nearby. And Enrico, for his part, found himself looking forward to things he had once avoided. School gates, slow walks, small talk that wasn't really small at all. Their friendship did not explode into anything loud. It deepened quietly. It settled naturally. It grew in the spaces between obligations. Outside, the city kept rushing. Between them, something calm, steady, and genuine was taking root, and neither of them tried to force it. The call came on a clear morning, the kind that makes New York look sharper than usual. Sunlight cut clean lines across Enrico's desk, glinting off glass and steel in his corner office. His calendar, usually packed wall to wall, glowed quietly on his screen, meetings stacked with military precision. He had just finished a quarterly review when Naomi entered, tablet held close to her chest. "Sir," she said, calm but precise, "the board has confirmed the relocation proposal." He didn't react immediately. His pen paused above a document. Outside, a helicopter traced a slow path across the skyline. Naomi continued, professional, unflinching. "They want you in Chicago permanently by the end of the quarter. New headquarters, full transition. Your presence is considered essential." The word hung lightly in the air. Enrico set his pen down. He leaned back in his chair, fingers resting loosely against the armrest, gaze drifting toward the city beyond the glass. For years, this would have been simple. A challenge, a decision, a move. He had relocated before, opened offices, shut down others, moved pieces across a corporate map without hesitation. This time, the thought did not land the same way. Naomi waited, respectful, observant. He turned slightly toward the window, seeing not just skyscrapers, but something more ordinary. A schoolyard gate, a small park path, a cafe window streaked with gentle rain. His mind moved unbidden to a child who called him Mr. Enrico, and a woman who walked through long clinic halls with steady grace. He didn't say their names. He didn't need to. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured, not emotional, just thoughtful. Naomi inclined her head. Of course, she placed a thin folder on his desk, aligned exactly as always, and stepped back. The elevator chimed softly behind him, doors sliding open in silent expectation. For the first time in years, a decision that should have felt purely strategic carried a different weight. Not heavier, more human. His phone buzzed faintly on the desk, a reminder for a meeting near Adeline's school later that afternoon. He glanced at it, then back at the skyline. The city looked the same. His life suddenly did not. A turning point had arrived, quiet, inevitable, and impossible to ignore. And for the first time, Enrico Hansen could not pretend that business was the only thing that mattered. That afternoon, the schoolyard looked ordinary. Sunlight spilled across the pavement in clean, bright lines. Backpacks bounced, laughter spilled through the air. Teachers moved with practiced ease, guiding small bodies toward the gates. Parents gathered in familiar clusters, some talking, some scrolling, some waiting in quiet patience. Enrico arrived on foot. No driver, no entourage, just him, coat draped over his arm, posture steady, steps unhurried. He stopped a few feet from where Carissa stood, exactly as he always did, close enough to share the moment, far enough to respect her space. She glanced at him once briefly, then returned her attention to the doors. He exhaled quietly through his nose. Long meeting, he replied. That was true. Not the whole truth, but enough. The doors burst open and a wave of children poured out, energy spilling in every direction. Carissa's posture shifted instantly. When Adeline appeared, her face lit up the way it always did, and she ran straight into her mother's arms without hesitation. "Mommy!" Carissa crouched, held her, kissed the top of her head, then straightened again, Adeline still tucked against her side. Only then did the little girl look toward Enrico. "Hi, Mr. Enrico." "Hello, Adeline," he said calmly, crouching just enough to meet her eye level. She studied him seriously for a moment, then nodded, satisfied, as if she had checked something important. They began walking toward the corner together, Adeline between them, talking about her day in a steady stream of half-finished sentences. At the crosswalk, Carissa turned to him. "Everything okay?" she asked, not prying, just steady. He hesitated, only for a fraction of a second. "Complicated," he said finally. She didn't push. She didn't fill the silence. She simply waited, calm, grounded, unflustered by uncertainty. Adeline tugged lightly on both their hands, pulling them forward as the light changed. They stepped off the curb together. As they walked, Enrico felt the weight of the board's decision again, not as a spreadsheet, not as a strategy, but as a real choice that would move real people in real directions. Chicago, or this sidewalk, this school gate, this small ordinary rhythm that had quietly become important to him. He didn't say any of that out loud. He didn't need to. Carissa sensed the shift in his pace, the slight change in his attention, and without knowing why, she slowed just a little to match him. The afternoon moved on. The decision did not, and beneath the noise of everyday life, the turning point tightened its grip. Later that evening, the sky softened into pale orange and fading blue. The park they often passed through on their walks felt quieter now, less hurried, less crowded, more open to lingering. A few joggers moved along the distant path. A couple sat on another bench, speaking in low voices. Enrico and Carissa stopped at their usual spot. Adeline had already been dropped at a friend's house for a short playdate, leaving them, for once, without anyone between them. They sat side by side on the bench, not touching, not distant, simply occupying the same space. For a moment, neither spoke. Enrico rested his forearms on his knees, hands loosely clasped, gaze fixed on the path ahead. The light caught the sharp lines of his profile, but softened the edges of his expression. Carissa watched the trees sway gently in the evening breeze, then turned her attention back to him. After a beat, he spoke, not rushed, not polished, just honest. "I've spent most of my life walking away from things that scare me emotionally." The words landed quietly. No confession, no performance, just truth. Carissa didn't react dramatically. She didn't look at him with pity. She simply listened, fully, patiently. He continued, voice steady. "I tell myself it's logical, efficient, necessary, but it's still leaving." She rested her hands in her lap, fingers relaxed. "And now?" she asked, calm, grounded. He exhaled slowly. "Now I'm being asked to leave again." Her gaze sharpened slightly, not in alarm, but in understanding. "For work?" He nodded once. A pause stretched between them, not heavy, just real. Carissa didn't lean toward him. She didn't pull away. She simply held the moment with quiet clarity. "Whatever you decide, I hope you choose what brings you peace, not what benefits your career, not what looks impressive, not what other people expect, just peace." Enrico turned his head slowly, meeting her eyes. For the first time that evening, something inside him wavered, not in weakness, but in recognition. Her calm honesty unsettled him more than any ultimatum ever could. Wind moved through the leaves above them. The sky deepened into dusk. He straightened slightly, feeling the weight of the decision in a new way, not as a business move, but as a measure of who he was becoming. Carissa did not wait for his answer. She didn't need one yet. They sat there together, two adults facing a choice that could pull their lives apart, yet connected by a stillness that felt unexpectedly steady. The light faded. The turning point tightened. And for the first time, Enrico understood that leaving might cost him something no amount of success could replace. The light had almost gone. Only a thin band of pale gold remained along the horizon, slipping slowly behind the buildings beyond the park. The air had cooled just enough to feel like evening instead of day. Enrico stayed where he was, forearms resting on his knees, eyes fixed somewhere beyond the path in front of him. Carissa didn't watch him. She simply sat beside him, steady, unintrusive, present in the same quiet way she always was. In that silence, his thoughts moved with unusual clarity. He realized, slowly, that this decision was not only about cities or offices or corporate influence. For years, he had framed every major choice as a calculation: risk versus reward, cost versus benefit, efficiency versus inconvenience, leaving it always fit neatly into that logic. Move the headquarters, expand the brand, optimize the structure, simple, clean, repeatable. Now, none of that logic felt sufficient. He pictured Chicago, new skyline, new boardrooms, new schedules, new routines that would swallow his time the way they always had. Then, without forcing it, he pictured this bench, Adeline's voice at the school gate calling him by name, Carissa walking beside him at an easy pace, a cafe window streaked with gentle rain. Not extraordinary things, ordinary ones, and somehow far more difficult to dismiss. His jaw tightened slightly, not in frustration, but in recognition. For the first time, he understood something he had spent years avoiding, that fear was not always something to outmaneuver. Sometimes it was information. It told him what mattered. Carissa shifted beside him, not toward him, just enough to break the stillness. "I won't ask you to stay," she said quietly, still looking ahead. "That wouldn't be fair." He turned his head just enough to see her profile. She continued, voice steady. "And I won't tell you to go. No pressure, no guilt, no manipulation, only clarity." He exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of her honesty settle into him rather than collide with him. Wind moved through the trees overhead, sending a few late leaves drifting toward the path. Somewhere in the distance, a car door closed with a muted thud. Enrico straightened slightly. He did not make a decision in that moment, but something inside him shifted from indecision into awareness, from avoidance into acceptance. Leaving was no longer just a professional move. Staying was no longer just sentiment. Both had become choices that revealed who he was, and for the first time in a long while, he did not want to make that choice alone. The sky darkened. The park grew quieter. Dusk slipped fully into night. The last ribbon of light dissolved behind the skyline, leaving the park wrapped in soft shadows and scattered street lamp glow. Crickets had begun their low, steady chorus, and the city beyond the trees hummed quietly in the distance. Enrico pushed himself upright from the bench. Not abruptly, not with relief, just with the slow certainty of someone who knew the moment had reached its natural end. Carissa rose beside him, smoothing her coat without looking at him directly. There was no tension in her posture, only calm readiness, the way she always carried herself when life required her to move forward. They stood there for a brief beat, side by side, neither of them rushing. Finally she spoke, voice even. "I should head back." He nodded once. Of course, no awkwardness, no unfinished sentences, just two adults recognizing that the world still waited beyond this quiet pocket of time. They began walking toward the path that led out of the park, steps unhurried, breathing in rhythm with the night air. Their shadows stretched long and soft across the ground, then shortened again beneath the next street lamp. At the edge of the park, Carissa paused. She turned toward him, not searching, not pleading, simply present. "Whatever you choose," she said quietly, "make sure it's yours, not the board's, not the city's, not anyone else's, his." He held her gaze for a moment longer than politeness required, something steady settling behind his eyes. "I will," he replied, simple, clear, certain. They parted without ceremony, Carissa toward her apartment, Enrico toward the waiting street where Vince would be nearby, as he always was. As he walked, the night felt different beneath his feet. Not lighter, not heavier, more honest. He replayed the conversation in his mind, not word for word, but in feeling. Her calm, her lack of pressure, the way she had refused to bend his choice in any direction except the one that would bring him peace. By the time he reached the curb, his phone buzzed again with another reminder about Chicago, another message about logistics, another push toward a decision. He glanced at the screen. Then at the dark stretch of road ahead. For years he would have answered immediately. Tonight, he did not. He slid the phone back into his coat pocket and looked up at the skyline, the same glass towers, the same moving lights, the same city he had ruled from above. Only now, he saw something different within it. Not just power, possibility. The turning point did not end here, but it had done its work, and for the first time Enrico Hansen knew, clearly, quietly, and without fear, that his next step would reveal who he truly was. The next morning arrived without drama. No thunder, no cinematic skies, just daylight slipping cleanly across the city, illuminating glass towers that looked as confident as they always had. Enrico was already in his office before the first wave of emails began to flood his inbox. His desk was arranged with its usual precision, files aligned, tablet centered, pen resting at a perfect angle. The private elevator hummed softly behind him, doors closed, waiting. He stood by the windows, hands loose at his sides, watching New York wake. Traffic thickened. Delivery trucks rolled into narrow streets. Lights blinked out in distant apartments. The city stretched, yawned, and moved on. Nothing about the scene had changed. Everything inside him had. A soft chime sounded as Naomi stepped off the elevator. She approached his desk with her usual measured efficiency, placing a slim folder exactly where it belonged. "The board is requesting your final position by tomorrow afternoon," she said calmly. "They've already begun preliminary plans for Chicago." Enrico turned from the window slowly. He did not look rushed. He did not look conflicted. He simply looked decided. He picked up the folder but did not open it. "Cancel the relocation," he said. Naomi did not flinch, but she did pause, just long enough to register the weight of his words. "All of it?" she asked, precise, not challenging. "All of it," he confirmed. A beat passed. Then, with the same steady tone, he continued. "Instead, prepare a restructuring plan that allows me to remain in New York as primary base of operations." Naomi's pen hovered for half a second and moved again. "Permanent?" "Yes." She inclined her head, already recalibrating in her mind. Schedules, contracts, negotiations, logistics that would ripple across the company. "Timeline?" "Flexible," he replied, "but decisive." She nodded once. "I'll begin." When she left, the elevator doors sealed behind her with a soft final sound. Enrico returned his gaze to the skyline. For years, decisions like this had been driven by numbers, leverage, and expansion. They had been clean, efficient, and emotionally distant. This one was not. He did not stay out of obligation. He did not stay out of fear. He stayed because, for the first time in a long while, he understood what he had been missing, and he was no longer willing to lose it again. Outside, the city moved at its usual speed. Inside the glass walls, a quiet shift settled into place. A choice had been made. And for the first time in years, Enrico Hansen felt aligned with it, not just professionally, but personally. The office felt different after Naomi left. Not louder, not quieter, just clearer. Enrico remained by the windows for a moment longer, hands resting lightly on the glass as traffic threaded its way through the streets far below. He watched delivery trucks, taxis, and pedestrians move through their familiar patterns, none of them aware that a decision made 30 floors above them would reshape an entire company. He turned away slowly and walked back to his desk. His phone lay face down where it always did. He picked it up, hesitated only briefly, then unlocked it. One name sat near the top of his recent calls. He pressed it. The line rang twice before connecting. "Enrico," Carissa's voice came through, steady, not surprised, just present. "I made my decision," he said calmly. A small pause followed, not anxious, just attentive. "You're staying," she said, not as a question. Another beat of silence, thoughtful rather than tense. He considered that for a moment longer than he usually would have. "I am," he replied simply. Carissa didn't celebrate. She didn't congratulate him. She didn't frame it as a victory. Her voice, when she spoke again, was steady and sincere. "Then I'm glad you chose that." No pressure, no expectation, just acceptance. Enrico leaned back slightly in his chair, eyes drifting again toward the skyline. "I wanted you to hear it from me," he added. "I appreciate that." Outside, a plane cut a slow path across the sky. Inside, the conversation felt grounded, unforced, real. Carissa spoke again, practical as always. "Adeline has a recital this evening. Small thing. Nothing formal. If you're free, you're welcome to come. No obligation. No performance. Just an open door." Enrico glanced at his calendar, full, demanding, unyielding, then back at the city beyond the glass. "I'll be there," he said. A quiet warmth moved through her voice. "She'll be happy to see you." They ended the call without fanfare. Enrico set the phone down and sat for a moment in the stillness of his office, letting the weight of his choice settle fully into place. Relocating would have been simpler, cleaner, more predictable. Staying was not about convenience, it was about alignment. He gathered his thoughts, opened his laptop, and began outlining the restructuring he had asked Naomi to prepare, not reluctantly, not defensively, but with calm intention. Outside, New York carried on beneath him. Inside, his path felt, for the first time in years, unmistakably his own, and across the city, a single mother continued her day, unaware of the corporate ripples now moving quietly toward her, but certain, in a way she didn't need to name, that something steady had chosen to remain. The recital hall was small, not a grand theater, just a community space tucked inside Adeline's school, folding chairs arranged in careful rows, a simple stage at the front, and a piano off to one side that had clearly seen better days. Parents filtered in slowly, balancing programs, jackets, and restless younger siblings. A low murmur of conversation filled the room, punctuated by the occasional burst of laughter from children who could not quite contain their excitement. Carissa sat near the middle, Adeline perched on the edge of her seat beside her, hair neatly brushed, hands folded too tightly in her lap. She looked calm. She wasn't. When the door at the back of the hall opened quietly, Carissa didn't turn right away. She didn't need to. Adeline did. Her face lit up instantly. "Mommy, he's here." Carissa turned just in time to see Enrico pause at the back, scanning the room with quiet composure. He was not in a suit, just a clean jacket over a simple shirt, presence steady without drawing attention. He met her gaze, inclined his head once, then made his way down the aisle with measured steps, careful not to disrupt anyone. When he reached their row, he stopped. "Is this seat taken?" he asked calmly. Carissa glanced at the empty chair beside her, then back at him. He sat without fuss, folding his coat neatly over his knees. Adeline shifted closer to him, not in clinginess, just in easy familiarity. The lights dimmed slightly. A teacher stepped onto the stage, welcoming everyone in a soft, practiced voice. Backstage, faint piano notes drifted through the curtains. Adeline squeezed her mother's hand once, then turned to Enrico. "You'll watch me, right?" "I will," he said simply. She nodded, satisfied. When her name was called, Adeline stood, smoothed her dress, and walked toward the stage with the kind of determination that made Carissa's chest tighten. Enrico watched quietly, not as an outsider, not as a patron, but as someone invested in this ordinary, fragile, meaningful moment. Adeline took her place beside the piano. Her fingers hovered for a second. Then she began. The notes weren't perfect. They wavered in places. A few came out softer than intended. None of that mattered. Carissa sat completely still, eyes fixed on her daughter. Enrico leaned back slightly in his chair, expression composed, but something warmer settled in his gaze. When Adeline finished, the room filled with polite applause, but her eyes went straight to one place, to her mother, to Enrico. She beamed, and in that quiet, unremarkable moment, his decision to stay felt less like a corporate strategy and more like something undeniably right. Outside, the city would still run at full speed. Inside this small hall, something steadier had taken root, not loud, not dramatic, simply real. And Enrico, sitting beside them, understood more clearly than ever why he had chosen to remain. The applause faded. Chairs scraped softly against the floor as parents began to stand, gather coats, and shepherd their children toward the exits. The recital hall slowly filled with a low, overlapping murmur of familiar, everyday voices. On stage, Adeline dipped into a small, slightly awkward bow, then turned instantly, searching the room. Her face lit up again when she found them. She hurried down the steps, weaving carefully through other children, and ran straight back to Carissa first. "You did beautifully," Carissa said, pulling her close without making a scene, voice warm but steady. Only then did Adeline look toward Enrico. "Did you hear all of it?" "I did," he replied calmly. "You played with confidence." Adeline considered that for a second, then nodded, clearly satisfied. In the hallway outside, the crowd thinned into loose clusters. Backpacks were zipped, coats were pulled on. Teachers exchanged quiet congratulations with parents. Carissa adjusted Adeline's jacket, smoothing the collar, brushing an invisible wrinkle from her sleeve. Enrico stood a few steps back, giving them space, not distant, just respectful. When Carissa finished, she turned toward him. "Thank you for coming," she said, not ceremonially, just sincerely. He inclined his head. "I wanted to be here. No flourish, no explanation, just fact." Adeline slipped her small hand into his without hesitation, tugging lightly. "Walk with us?" He hesitated only briefly, then nodded. They stepped out into the cool evening together. The sidewalk glowed beneath streetlights. Traffic moved in steady lines. The city felt exactly like itself, busy, impatient, alive. Yet the rhythm between them was slower. They walked side by side, Adeline between them, swinging their hands lightly as she skipped ahead, then fell back into step. Carissa glanced at him once, thoughtful. "You stayed," she said, not as a question, not as a test, simply as acknowledgement. "I did," he replied. She didn't push further. She didn't frame it as destiny or sacrifice. She simply accepted it. As they reached the corner, Adeline pointed out a storefront window filled with bright displays, pulling them toward it with childlike enthusiasm. Enrico led her. Carissa followed, steady, unhurried. For the first time in years, staying no longer felt like constraint to him. It felt like alignment, not with a company, not with a city. With a life he was finally allowing himself to choose. The night moved on around them. Between them, something calm and certain remained, not loud, not forced, simply lived. And in that ordinary walk home, Enrico Hansen understood, more clearly than ever, what his decision truly meant. Later that night, New York glowed the way it always had, sharp lights cutting through darkness, movement constant, ambition never resting. Enrico stood alone in his penthouse, glass walls reflecting the city back at him like a vast, living map. A bottle of water rested unopened on the counter. His phone lay silent on the table. Nothing around him had changed. Everything about how he felt inside this space had. He moved slowly toward the window, hands resting lightly at his sides, gaze traveling across the skyline he had built his career beneath. For years, this view had defined success to him. Distance, elevation, control, separation from the crowd. Tonight, it felt different. He did not think of boardrooms, stock prices, or expansion plans. Instead, his mind returned to smaller things, a trembling child beneath an umbrella, a breathless mother running through rain, a quiet bench at dusk, a school gate filled with laughter, a tiny stage and a wavering piano note, not monumental moments, human ones. He exhaled slowly, feeling something settle that had been restless for years. He had not stayed because of obligation, not because of guilt, not because of pressure. He stayed because, for the first time in a long time, he had recognized what mattered before it was already gone. Across the city, lights blinked out one by one in distant apartments. A train slid along its elevated tracks. A siren drifted briefly through the night and faded. Enrico turned away from the window. His office would still demand him in the morning. The restructuring would still require difficult conversations. The board would still challenge him. The city would still test him. None of that had vanished. But something had shifted in how he would meet it. Not harder, clearer. He picked up his phone and, without hesitation this time, typed a simple message. "Thank you for tonight." He didn't add more. He didn't need to. A few moments later, his screen lit up. Anytime, he set the phone down again and moved toward his bedroom, the city humming quietly behind him. Outside, New York remained relentless. Inside, Enrico Hansen felt, for the first time in years, undeniably at home, not because of glass walls or private elevators, but because he had chosen connection over distance. The decision was complete, and it was his. The city woke the same way it always had. Sirens threaded through distant streets. Delivery trucks backed up with short, familiar beeps. Lights slid cleanly across glass towers that had stood unchanged for years. From the outside, nothing looked different. Inside Carissa's apartment, the morning felt steadier. Sunlight spilled softly across the kitchen counter where two plates already sat neatly beside a pot of coffee. The small space carried its usual warmth, quiet, organized, lived in, but the air held something calmer than before. Carissa moved through her routine with the same efficiency she always had. Kettle on, bag packed, uniform folded carefully on the chair, a note left beside Adeline's breakfast plate, written in steady, familiar handwriting. Down the hall, Adeline stirred, then padded barefoot toward the kitchen, hair sleep-tousled, eyes still heavy. "Morning, Mommy. Morning, baby." Carissa set a glass of milk in front of her, then brushed a few strands of hair from her forehead with a gentle, practiced touch. Adeline took a sip, then glanced toward the window where the city stretched beyond their building. "Do you think Mr. Enrico will come again?" Not anxious, not demanding, just curious. Carissa didn't rush her answer. "Maybe," she said simply. "If he says he will." Adeline nodded, satisfied, and returned to her breakfast. Across the city, in a glass-walled penthouse, Enrico stood at his own window, watching the same skyline from a different height. His office lights were already on. His calendar glowed on his tablet. Naomi's first message of the day had just appeared on his screen. He should have felt the familiar pull of urgency. Instead, he lingered. He watched a single delivery truck ease down a narrow street below, then turned his attention to the small park path he sometimes walked, empty now, waiting. He moved with the same precision he always had, but his steps carried less tension. Coffee poured, jacket buttoned, phone slipped into his pocket. Before leaving, he paused. For a brief moment, he pictured an ordinary morning in a modest apartment across town, a small girl at a table, a steady mother tying back her hair, a life built from quiet endurance. He didn't dwell. He simply carried that image with him as he stepped into the elevator. The doors closed, the city rolled on, and beneath its familiar rhythm, something new, steady, unforced, and real, had quietly begun. Mid-morning light settled over the clinic in clean, even bands. The new equipment hummed quietly, a steady backdrop to the low murmur of voices in the halls. Nurses moved with practiced ease. Patients waited with the same mix of patience and restlessness that filled every medical space in the city. Carissa moved through it all without hesitation. She checked charts, reassured anxious families, adjusted pillows, listened carefully when no one else had the time. Her pace was steady, her focus sharp, the same as it had always been. Yet there was a subtle difference in her presence, not lighter, just less burdened. At a break in her shift, she stepped into a small side room to gather supplies. As she turned back toward the hallway, she paused. Enrico stood near the reception desk. No announcement, no entourage, no display of importance, just him. Coat draped neatly over his arm, posture calm, expression composed. The receptionist spoke to him in low tones. He nodded once, then glanced down the hallway as if sensing her attention. Their eyes met. He inclined his head, respectful, unassuming. Carissa approached, wiping her hands on a cloth without hurry. "You're here," she said, not surprised, not formal, simply acknowledging. "I had a meeting nearby," he replied evenly. "I wanted to check in, not check up, not inspect, just check in." She studied him for a second longer than politeness required, then nodded. "They're working well," she said, meaning the equipment without having to say it. "I'm glad." A nurse passed behind them, offering a brief greeting that Enrico returned with quiet courtesy. No one stared, no one whispered. He did not draw attention to himself. Carissa glanced down the hallway toward room 214, where an elderly patient had grown attached to her. "He asked about you," she added casually. Enrico's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "I hope he's doing better. He is." A brief pause settled between them, not awkward, just real. Carissa folded the cloth and set it aside. "You don't have to come here," she said, not testing, just stating. No justification followed, no grand explanation. From the waiting room, faint laughter drifted, a child's voice, light and unrestrained. Outside, sirens threaded briefly through traffic and faded. Enrico took a small step back, giving her space to return to work. "Call me if you need anything," he said simply. She nodded once, not with gratitude that owed him, with trust that did not flatter. It simply existed. He turned and left as quietly as he had arrived. Carissa watched him go for half a second, then returned to her rounds, steady and unbroken. Across the city, a life built on power continued to run at full speed. Inside this clinic, a quieter kind of support had chosen to remain, not loud, not intrusive, simply present. And that, more than anything, marked the beginning of something new. Afternoons began to settle into a quiet rhythm, not a schedule, not an arrangement, just a pattern that formed without anyone announcing it. On certain days, Enrico would arrive at Adeline's school a few minutes early, never the first parent, never the last. He stood where he always had, a few steps from Carissa, close enough to share the moment, far enough to respect her space. Carissa never asked him to come. He never explained why he did. The bell rang, doors opened, the flood of children poured out in familiar waves of noise and motion. Adeline spotted him instantly. "Mr. Enrico!" She didn't run at him the way she ran at her mother. She simply moved toward him with the easy confidence of a child who knows she is safe. He crouched to her level without hesitation. "How was your day?" She told him. About math she almost understood, a story she had read, a picture she had drawn that she insisted he had to see. He listened the way he always did, fully, patiently, without pretending interest or rushing her along. Carissa watched this exchange more than she admitted to herself. Not suspiciously, not protectively, thoughtfully. On their walk home, Adeline often drifted ahead, chasing shadows or hopping over cracks in the sidewalk. When she did, Carissa and Enrico fell naturally into step beside one another. Their conversation stayed simple, clinic updates, school moments, small observations about the city, nothing performative, nothing grand. One afternoon, as they turned onto Carissa's street, Adeline paused at the curb and looked up at her mother. "Mommy, can Mr. Enrico come in?" Carissa hesitated, not because she didn't trust him, but because she always moved carefully when it came to her daughter's world. She glanced at Enrico. He met her gaze calmly, no expectation in his eyes. "If you're comfortable," he said quietly. "If not, that's fine." Carissa looked back at Adeline, then at the modest building behind her. Just for a few minutes, she decided. Adeline beamed. Inside, the apartment felt exactly as it always had, warm, lived in, ordinary, in the best possible way. Enrico stood near the doorway, respectful of the space, taking in small details without staring. Adeline dragged out a box of drawings and spread them across the floor. "Look," she said proudly. He crouched again, examining each one with genuine attention. Carissa watched from the kitchen, hands resting on the counter, heart steady. In that quiet, unremarkable moment, something shifted. Enrico was no longer just a man who had helped them once. He was becoming, slowly and naturally, part of their world. Not loudly, not dramatically, just present. And that, more than any promise, marked the start of their new beginning. Evenings in Carissa's apartment began to feel different, not louder, not fuller, just steadier. The routine remained the same. Dinner on the small kitchen table, homework spread across the counter, dishes rinsed and stacked neatly, bath water running, then quieting, pajamas pulled on with sleepy protests. What changed was the sense of ease that lingered beneath it. On a Tuesday that felt like any other, Enrico stayed a little longer than he had before, not by invitation, not by pressure, simply because the moment allowed it. Adeline sat cross-legged on the living room floor, carefully coloring inside the lines of a picture she insisted was very important. Carissa moved between the kitchen and the table, preparing a simple meal without hurry. Enrico remained near the doorway at first, respectful of the space, aware that this was their world, not his. Then, slowly, he shifted closer. He didn't touch anything. He didn't make himself at home. He simply existed there with quiet presence. Adeline looked up from her paper. "Can you sit?" He glanced at Carissa. She met his gaze, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. He lowered himself onto the floor across from Adeline, careful, unintrusive, fully attentive. She handed him a crayon. "Draw with me." He hesitated, not out of discomfort, but because this was unfamiliar territory. Boardrooms he knew, negotiations he mastered. A 6-year-old with a box of crayons was something else entirely. Still, he accepted. His drawing wasn't perfect. It wasn't polished. It was simple. A house with uneven windows, a tree that leaned slightly to the left, a sky filled with exaggerated blue. Adeline studied it seriously. Then she smiled. "It's good." Carissa leaned against the counter, arms folded loosely, watching them without intruding. In that small, ordinary moment, something settled into place. Later, at the table, Adeline chattered freely as she ate, talking about school, friends, and her drawing as if it were a masterpiece. Enrico listened, not politely, but fully, the way he had learned to listen since that night in the rain. When it was time for bed, Carissa guided Adeline down the hall, tucking her in with the same gentle care she always had. Enrico remained in the living room, standing quietly, not wandering, not waiting impatiently. A few minutes later, Carissa returned. "She likes you," she said, not teasing, not cautious, just honest. "I like her too," he replied simply. No grand realization followed, no sweeping declaration. Just two adults standing in a modest apartment, recognizing that something real had taken root. Not forced, not planned, simply grown. And in that quiet truth, a new beginning continued to take shape. Time did not announce itself as it moved forward. There was no dramatic shift, no sweeping moment where everything suddenly felt different. Instead, change arrived in small, ordinary ways, the kind people only recognize when they look back. Enrico's presence settled naturally into their lives. Not as a guest, not as a rescuer, not as someone hovering at the edges, simply as someone who showed up, stayed steady, and treated both Carissa and Adeline with the same quiet respect. On some mornings, he walked with them toward the school before heading to his office. On others, he arrived in the late afternoon, standing a few steps back from the gate, posture calm, attention clear. Adeline stopped asking if he would come. She simply expected that, if he said he would, he would. Carissa noticed that most of all. She didn't lean on him. She didn't ask for help. She didn't surrender her independence. But the weight she carried no longer felt quite as solitary. Adeline balanced on the edge, legs swinging lightly, humming to herself while she watched the sky shift from gold to soft purple. Carissa rested her hands in her lap, breathing easy, eyes steady. Enrico sat beside them, not at the center, not apart, simply present. No one spoke for a while. They didn't need to. When Adeline finally turned toward her mother, her voice was quiet but certain. "Mommy, he's our family now, isn't he?" The question landed softly, without drama, without urgency, like something she had been carrying for a while and had finally decided to say. Carissa didn't answer right away. She looked at her daughter first, then at Enrico. His expression did not change, no rush, no expectation, only steady openness. Carissa squeezed Adeline's hand gently. "I think," she said slowly, "he's someone who cares about us very much." Adeline accepted that without hesitation. Enrico heard her. He didn't reach for grand words. He didn't make promises he hadn't earned. The sun slipped fully below the horizon. Streetlights flickered to life along the path. The city carried on beyond the park, loud, restless, unchanged. Streetlights flickered to life along the path. The city carried on beyond the park, loud, restless, unchanged. Here, in this quiet pocket of evening, 3 people sat together in something steady and sincere. Enrico was still a powerful CEO. Carissa was still a hard-working single mother. Adeline was still a bright, curious little girl. None of that had vanished. And for the first time in years, Enrico Hansen did not feel like a man standing above the city looking down. He felt like a man standing within a life that had chosen him back. Home at last, not because of glass walls or success, because of connection. If you enjoyed this story, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more stories like this.